A mother's embrace should feel like safety. Hers felt like a casket closing. She didn't just kill for money. She made her own children the currency. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the Black Widow, the mother who made murder a family business. Now relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We're about to enter the twisted world of a woman who turned love into a weapon and family into a graveyard. Judy Benoano didn't just murder. She perfected it, turning poison into profit and trust into tombstones. For nearly 2 decades, she collected insurance checks where other people collected memories, and the bodies she left behind all had one thing in common. They loved her. This is the story of Florida's Black Widow, a serial killer who proved that the deadliest predator doesn't lurk in dark alleys. She rocks you to sleep, whispers that everything will be okay, and watches as the life drains from your eyes. Judy Welty entered the world in 1943 in Quanah, Texas, and from her very first breath, darkness seemed to follow. Her mother was absent, not just physically, but emotionally, a ghost in her own home. Her father? He filled that void with something far more sinister than neglect. Behind closed doors, where a child should find protection, Judy found violation. The man who was supposed to guard her innocence became the one who stole it, piece by piece, night after terrifying night. Child abuse doesn't just wound, it rewrites the entire architecture of a soul. For Judy, those formative years weren't about learning to trust or love. They were about learning to survive. And survival, she discovered, required something most people never develop: the ability to disconnect completely from human emotion. When you're a child being destroyed by the person who created you, empathy becomes a liability. Compassion becomes weakness. And conscience, that's just another luxury you can't afford. By the time she reached adolescence, Judy had already mastered the art of the mask. She could smile when she wanted to scream. She could charm when she wanted to strike. Most dangerously, she'd learned that people, especially men, were tools to be used, resources to be exploited, and when they'd served their purpose, obstacles to be removed. Her first marriage came early, a rushed affair to James Goodyear, a sergeant in the United States Air Force. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect military family. Beautiful wife, decorated husband, children who smiled in photographs. But inside their home, something else was brewing. Judy wasn't interested in building a life. She was interested in building an empire, and that required capital. James Goodyear died in 1971. The official cause? Heart failure. He was a fit, healthy, active-duty military man who suddenly collapsed and never got back up. The doctors didn't question it too hard. Sometimes young men just drop dead. Tragic, but not suspicious. What they didn't know was that Judy had been carefully, methodically poisoning him with arsenic, feeding him death in doses small enough to mimic natural illness but consistent enough to guarantee the outcome she wanted. The insurance payout was substantial, 3 policies, all of which Judy had quietly taken out in the months before his death. She collected the money with tears in her eyes and grief on her lips, playing the devastated widow with Oscar-worthy precision. But behind those tears, her mind was already calculating, already planning, already hunting for the next opportunity. She didn't stop with her husband. Her pattern was establishing itself, sharpening with each kill. She moved through relationships like a shark through water, always moving, always feeding, always leaving destruction in her wake. She changed her name to Benoano, a Spanish translation of Goodyear, as if reinventing her identity could somehow cleanse the blood from her hands. Couldn't, and never would. What made Judy particularly terrifying wasn't just her willingness to kill. Plenty of people murder. What made her a nightmare was her patience. She didn't strike in rage or passion. She planned. She waited. She befriended her victims. made them dependent on her, made them love her. And then, when they were at their most vulnerable, when their guard was completely down, she struck with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a corpse. Her son, Michael Benoano, was born with challenges. He had seizures, required medication, needed extra care. To most mothers, a child with disabilities represents a call to deeper love, a reason to fight harder. To Judy, he represented something else entirely, a financial burden that could be converted into a financial asset. She just needed the right circumstances, the right moment, the right method. That moment came in 1980. Michael was 19 years old, living with his mother, dependent on her for his medication, for his care, for his very survival. Judy convinced him to go canoeing on the East River in Florida. Just the two of them, a mother and son bonding experience. Michael, who trusted her completely, who had no reason to suspect the woman who gave him life would be the one to take it away, agreed happily. They paddled out into the water, the sun bright overhead, the river calm and deceptively peaceful. And then Judy made her move. She'd been poisoning Michael for months, weakening him gradually with arsenic and heavy metals, making sure his body was compromised, making sure he wouldn't be strong enough to fight back when the moment came. The canoe tipped. Whether Judy capsized it deliberately or Michael's weakened state caused him to lose balance, the result was the same. He went into the water wearing heavy braces, leg braces that Judy had insisted he wear despite his protests, braces that now acted like anchors, dragging him down into the dark water. He called out for his mother, thrashing, desperate, drowning. And Judy? She paddled to safety. She didn't reach for him. She didn't call for help. She didn't dive in to save the son she'd carried in her womb for 9 months. She watched him sink beneath the surface, watched the bubbles rise and then stop, watched the water go still. And then she paddled to shore, dripping wet and screaming for help, playing the role of the traumatized mother who just lost her precious boy to a tragic accident. The insurance policies on Michael's life paid out handsomely. Judy collected every penny, her grief convincing enough to silence any questions. She'd gotten away with it again. She'd turned her own child into profit, transformed motherhood into murder, and no one suspected a thing. But Michael wasn't enough. The money never lasted as long as she needed. Her lifestyle, her comfort, her desires, her insatiable need for more demanded constant feeding. And Judy had developed a taste for this particular kind of hunting. She'd perfected her method, refined her approach, and now she was ready to scale up her operation. Her next victim was already in her sights, already being groomed, already being poisoned. His name was Bobby Joe Morris, and he had no idea that the woman he loved, the woman he was building a life with, was the same woman who would soon be measuring him for a coffin. The monster that Judy had become wasn't born in a single moment of violence. It was cultivated over decades, nurtured by trauma and twisted by choice. She'd taken the horrors inflicted upon her as a child and weaponized them, transforming victim into predator, wounded into destroyer. And she was just getting started. Bobby Joe Morris was everything Judy needed in a man. Trusting, financially stable, and most importantly, insurable. He met her in Pensacola, Florida, where she'd set up her next hunting ground after Michael's death. To Bobby, Judy was magnetic, beautiful, attentive, seemingly devoted. She laughed at his jokes, listened to his stories, and made him feel like the center of her universe. He had no way of knowing that her universe was actually a graveyard, and he was just the latest plot waiting to be filled. They moved to Trinidad, Colorado together in 1978, before Michael's murder, establishing what looked like a normal domestic life. Judy opened a beauty salon, playing the role of the hardworking businesswoman building her American dream. But her real business wasn't hairstyling, it was death, and business was about to boom. Bobby Joe started getting sick almost immediately after their relationship became serious. It began subtly: stomach problems, weakness, unexplained fatigue. He'd always been healthy, active, full of energy, but now he was deteriorating, his body betraying him in ways neither he nor his doctors could explain. He went to hospitals, underwent tests, tried different medications. Nothing worked. Nothing helped. He kept getting worse. What Bobby didn't know was that Judy was poisoning him with the same methodical precision she'd used on James Goodyear. Arsenic in his food, arsenic in his drinks, small doses that accumulated in his tissue and bone, slowly shutting down his organs one by one. She was patient, careful, making sure his decline looked natural, making sure no single incident would raise alarms. She was conducting murder like a symphony, each poisoned meal another note in a deadly composition. Bobby Joe Morris died in Trinidad, Colorado in 1978. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, his heart simply giving out after months of mysterious illness. He was 39 years old. The local authorities performed an autopsy, standard procedure, but they weren't looking for poison. They were looking for disease, for natural causes, for anything except deliberate murder. Judy had counted on this, had planned for this. She knew that doctors see what they expect to see, and what they expected was tragedy, not homicide. The insurance money flowed into Judy's accounts like water, tens of thousands of dollars from multiple policies she'd carefully arranged. She grieved publicly, played the heartbroken partner, and then quietly began planning her next move. She was building an empire now, a financial fortress constructed on corpses and cemented with insurance fraud. But Judy's reign of terror wasn't limited to her romantic partners. She was an equal opportunity killer, willing to murder anyone who stood between her and money, anyone who threatened her carefully constructed facade. Her pattern was becoming clear to those who knew where to look. People around Judy Benoano had a disturbing tendency to die suddenly, unexpectedly, and always, while heavily insured. She returned to Pensacola after Bobby's death, reestablishing herself in Florida's Panhandle. She was becoming bolder now, more confident in her ability to kill without consequence. The success of her previous murders had created a dangerous feedback loop. Each successful kill made her feel more invincible, more untouchable, more convinced that she'd found the perfect crime. Her next target was already warming up in the bullpen. John Gentry, too, a successful businessman who made the fatal mistake of falling in love with Judy Benoano. He met her in 1983, and like Bobby Joe and James before him, he was immediately captivated. Judy had perfected her act by now. She was the damaged woman looking for a good man, the struggling single mother who just needed someone strong to lean on, the sexy, attentive partner who made a man feel like a king. John proposed marriage, and Judy accepted with all the enthusiasm of a spider welcoming a fly into her web. She'd already taken out massive life insurance policies on him, already begun the poisoning process, already started planning how she'd spend the money once he was dead. But this time, Judy was going to get creative. She'd used poison successfully for years, but it was slow, sometimes unpredictable. She needed something more dramatic, something that would yield a faster payout and attract less scrutiny. She decided on a car bomb. In June 1983, John Gentry climbed into his car, turned the key, and was instantly engulfed in a massive explosion. The blast ripped through the vehicle, shrapnel tearing into his body, flames consuming the interior. He should have died instantly. By all logical calculations, he should have been obliterated. But somehow, impossibly, John survived. Badly injured, burned, traumatized, but alive. And that survival was Judy's first real mistake. Because John Gentry, lying in his hospital bed covered in bandages and racked with pain, started asking questions, started remembering things, started noticing patterns he'd overlooked when he was blinded by love. The mysterious illnesses he'd suffered in the weeks before the explosion. The vitamins Judy insisted he take every day. The way she'd been so insistent about him taking out those insurance policies. The way she'd been oddly absent the morning of the explosion, despite usually being glued to his side. He went to the police with his suspicions, and suddenly, the walls Judy had built around her criminal empire started showing cracks. Investigators began pulling threads, looking into her past, interviewing people who'd known her, and what they found was horrifying. A trail of bodies stretching back over a decade, all of them connected to Judy Benoano, all of them insured, all of them dead under suspicious circumstances. They exhumed Bobby Joe Morris's body first. His corpse, preserved by the embalming process, still contained evidence of the poison that killed him. The arsenic levels in his tissue were astronomical. There was no way his death was natural. Then they looked at James Goodyear's death, and though his body was too deteriorated to test, the pattern was unmistakable. They investigated Michael Benuano's drowning, and the pieces fell into place. The unnecessary leg braces, the life insurance policies, the arsenic found in tissue samples taken during his autopsy but previously unexplained. Judy Benuano wasn't just a murderer. She was a serial killer who'd been operating in plain sight for over a decade, using the cover of grief and the shield of motherhood to commit atrocity after atrocity. She'd killed her husband, her boyfriend, her own son, and had attempted to murder her fiancé. And she'd done it all for money, for comfort, for the lifestyle she felt entitled to regardless of how many lives she had to end to maintain it. The investigation expanded rapidly, uncovering even more victims, more suspicious deaths, more insurance fraud. Judy had left a trail of destruction across multiple states, and now that investigators knew what to look for, the evidence was overwhelming. She'd been so confident in her invincibility that she'd gotten sloppy, leaving patterns too obvious to ignore once someone actually started looking. Judy was arrested in 1983, charged initially with the attempted murder of John Gentry. But prosecutors knew that was just the beginning. They were building cases for Michael's murder, for Bobby Joe's murder, potentially for James Goodyear's murder. They were going to make sure that Judy Benuano never hurt anyone ever again. In custody, Judy maintained her innocence with the same conviction she'd maintained her grief. She was a victim, she claimed. She was being persecuted. She'd done nothing wrong. The evidence was circumstantial, the accusations baseless. She played the role of the wronged woman with the same skill she'd played the grieving widow and devoted mother. But this time, no one was buying it. The mask had finally slipped, and the monster underneath was fully visible. Judy Benuano's reign of terror was over. Now came the reckoning. The courtroom in Orlando, Florida became a theater of horrors as prosecutors laid out the full scope of Judy Benuano's crimes. The trial for Michael Benuano's murder began in 1985, and what emerged was a portrait of evil so calculating, so methodical, so utterly devoid of maternal instinct that even hardened court observers found themselves shaken. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. They presented evidence of the arsenic poisoning, traces of heavy metals found in Michael's tissues during the original autopsy that had been noted but not investigated at the time. They showed the jury the life insurance policies Judy had taken out on her disabled son, policies worth over $125,000 in total. They demonstrated how she'd systematically weakened him in the months before the drowning, making him physically incapable of survival if something went wrong on the water. But it was the testimony about the drowning itself that truly horrified the courtroom. Witnesses described how Judy had insisted Michael wear his leg braces that day despite his objections, how she'd been adamant about the canoeing trip even though Michael wasn't comfortable on the water. An expert testified about the impossibility of a drowning being accidental when the victim was wearing heavy metal braces in deep water. It was essentially a death sentence, and Judy had personally fastened those braces onto her son's legs knowing exactly what she was doing. The defense tried to paint Judy as a devoted mother overcome by tragedy, a woman who'd suffered the unthinkable loss of a child and was now being victimized by a justice system looking for someone to blame. But the evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern too clear. This wasn't a mother grieving a tragic accident. This was a predator who'd murdered her own offspring for profit. One of the most chilling moments of the trial came when investigators testified about what they'd found when they searched Judy's home. Among her possessions were books on poisons, manuals on insurance fraud, and meticulous financial records showing her tracking of policy payouts. She'd kept a ledger of death, documenting her kills like a businesswoman tracking inventory. It wasn't murder to her, it was revenue generation. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty. First-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and grief. Relief that justice was finally being served, grief for Michael and all the other victims who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. But prosecutors weren't finished. With Michael's conviction secured, they moved forward with charges in Bobby Joe Morris's murder. Judy was extradited to Colorado, where another trial began. Another jury heard another tale of systematic poisoning and calculated murder. The pattern repeated. The arsenic, the insurance policies, the fake grief followed by quiet collection of money. Bobby Joe Morris had died slowly, painfully, betrayed by the woman he loved, and all of it was premeditated, planned, executed with cold precision. Another guilty verdict. Another life sentence. Judy's empire of death was crumbling, and with each trial, more victims came to light. Investigators found evidence of other suspicious deaths connected to her, other insurance policies, other relationships that ended abruptly with funerals and payouts. The true body count might never be known. Judy wasn't talking, and some of her victims had been dead for so long that proving murder would be impossible. The trial for John Gentry's attempted murder came next, and this one had a different energy. John testified, walking into that courtroom on his own 2 feet, a living refutation of Judy's plans. He described the explosion, the flames, the moment he realized someone had tried to murder him. He described the slow dawning horror as he connected his illness to the vitamins Judy had been giving him, as he realized the woman he'd planned to marry had been systematically trying to kill him. John's testimony was powerful, but the physical evidence was even more damning. Investigators had traced the bomb components, found Judy's fingerprints on materials used in its construction, discovered her research into explosives and detonation devices. She'd built that bomb herself, planted it in John's car, and then waited for news of his death so she could play the grieving fiancé and collect another insurance payout. The media had a field day with the trials, dubbing Judy Benoano the Black Widow, a nickname that captured both her deadly nature and her method, luring victims into intimacy before striking with lethal precision. The coverage was intense, turning the case into a national sensation. People were simultaneously horrified and fascinated by this woman who could smile sweetly while planning murder, who could attend funerals for people she'd killed and shed convincing tears. Judy's courtroom demeanor throughout the trials was remarkable for its consistency. She maintained her innocence, showed no remorse, displayed no emotion except occasional indignation at being accused. She never broke character, never admitted guilt, never showed the slightest hint of conscience. It was as if the part of her that should feel guilt had been surgically removed, leaving only the calculating predator beneath. Psychologists who evaluated her diagnosed her as a sociopath, someone fundamentally incapable of empathy, someone who viewed other people as objects to be used rather than humans to be respected. Her childhood trauma had damaged her, certainly, but at some point she'd made choices, had decided that her pain justified inflicting pain on others, that her desires mattered more than other people's lives. The sentencing phase for Michael's murder came down to a single question: death or life in prison. Florida had the death penalty, and prosecutors were seeking it. They argued that Judy represented a unique danger. She was a serial killer who'd murdered her own child, who'd shown no remorse, who would kill again if given the opportunity. She didn't deserve mercy because she'd shown none to her victims. The defense argued against the death penalty, citing her troubled childhood, her history of abuse, the mitigating factors that had created the person she'd become. But the jury wasn't swayed. They'd seen the evidence, heard the testimony, looked into the eyes of a woman who drowned her disabled son for insurance money. They recommended death. The judge agreed. Judy Benoano was sentenced to death by electrocution, one of the first women to receive Florida's death penalty in decades. She was transferred to death row at Broward Correctional Institution, joining a small population of female inmates awaiting execution. On death row, Judy continued to maintain her innocence, filing appeal after appeal, claiming prosecutorial misconduct, ineffective counsel, biased juries. She insisted she was a victim of circumstance, a woman wrongly convicted by a system that needed a monster to blame. She gave interviews, wrote letters, maintained correspondence with people who believed in her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence of her guilt. The years passed slowly on death row: 1985, 1990, 1995. Other inmates came and went, some executed, some having their sentences commuted. But Judy remained, her appeals systematically denied, her execution date approaching with the inevitability of a thunderstorm on the horizon. She never confessed, never showed remorse, never acknowledged the pain she'd caused or the lives she'd destroyed. To the very end, Judy Benoano maintained the mask, playing the role of the wronged woman, the innocent victim of an overzealous justice system. But everyone knew the truth. The evidence didn't lie. The bodies didn't lie. Judy Benoano was exactly what the prosecution had claimed: a cold-blooded serial killer who'd murdered for profit and hidden behind the facade of motherhood and femininity to escape justice for over a decade. Her execution date was finally set, March 30th, 1998. After 13 years on death row, the state of Florida was going to carry out the sentence. Judy Benoano would face the same fate she'd inflicted on her victims: a death she didn't want, couldn't escape, and absolutely deserved. The final chapter of the Black Widow story was about to be written, and this time, she wouldn't be the one holding the pen. March 30th, 1998 dawned humid and oppressive in Florida, the kind of morning where the air feels thick enough to choke on. Inside Florida State Prison in Stark, preparations were underway for an execution that had been delayed, appealed, and postponed for over a decade. Judy Benoano, now 54 years old, was hours away from becoming the first woman executed in Florida since 1848, and only the third woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The media descended on Stark like vultures, satellite trucks lining the roads, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the prison gates. The execution of a woman, especially a woman dubbed the Black Widow, a mother who'd murdered her own child, was international news. Protesters gathered on both sides of the issue. Death penalty opponents holding vigil with candles, victims' advocates carrying signs demanding justice for Michael, for Bobby Joe, for all of Judy's victims. Inside the prison, Judy spent her final hours in a holding cell near the death chamber. She'd maintained her composure throughout her time on death row, never breaking down, never admitting guilt, never showing the fear or remorse that most condemned inmates eventually display. Even now, with death just hours away, she remained defiant, insisting to anyone who would listen that she was innocent, that the state was about to murder an innocent woman. Her final meal request was relatively simple. She declined to order anything special, accepting instead the standard prison fare. It was almost as if she was maintaining her innocence through the small details, refusing to participate in the ritual of the condemned. She gave a few final interviews, repeating her claims of innocence, painting herself as a victim of circumstantial evidence and a justice system too eager to convict. But the relatives of her victims saw through the performance. John Gentry, the man who'd survived her car bombing, had come to witness the execution. So had members of Bobby Joe Morris's family. They weren't there for revenge. They were there for closure, to see the woman who destroyed so many lives finally face the consequences of her actions. They'd waited 13 years for this moment, 13 years of appeals and delays and legal maneuvering. Now finally, justice was at hand. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky by death row inmates, had been Florida's execution method for decades. It was a brutal, archaic device, a wooden chair with leather straps and a metal cap that delivered thousands of volts of electricity directly into the brain. Critics called it cruel and unusual punishment. Supporters called it justice. Regardless of terminology, it was about to claim another life. At 7 a.m., the warden came to Judy's holding cell. It was time. She was given the opportunity to make a final statement, to say anything she wanted before the execution proceeded. This was her last chance to confess, to apologize, to acknowledge the pain she'd caused, to show even a glimmer of the humanity she'd denied her victims. She declined. No final statement, no confession, no remorse. Even facing death, Judy Benoano maintained her innocence, clinging to the lie with the same determination she'd used to kill. It was perhaps the most chilling aspect of her entire story, her absolute refusal to acknowledge her crimes, her complete inability or unwillingness to feel guilt for the murders she'd committed. The walk from the holding cell to the execution chamber is called the last mile. though it's actually only a few dozen feet. Judy made that walk with her head held high, showing no fear, no hesitation. The witnesses were already seated in the viewing area. Family members of victims, prison officials, media representatives, all there to watch the state carry out its ultimate punishment. The execution chamber was small, clinical, brightly lit. The electric chair sat in the center like a throne of death, waiting for its next occupant. Guards helped Judy into the chair, strapping her arms, her legs, her torso with thick leather restraints. The metal cap was placed on her head, the electrode sponge soaked in saline solution to conduct electricity more efficiently, to make the death faster and supposedly more humane. Judy's face was covered with a black hood, hiding her expression from the witnesses. The warden asked one final time if she had anything to say. Silence. The executioner, hidden behind a one-way mirror, waited for the signal. At 7:08 a.m., the warden gave the order. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Judy Benoano's body. Her body convulsed against the restraints, muscles contracting involuntarily, the current forcing every nerve to fire simultaneously. Smoke rose from the electrode cap. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber. The first jolt lasted for several seconds, then stopped. Prison protocol required a pause to allow the body to cool before checking for vital signs. A doctor approached, checked for a pulse, listened for breath sounds. Judy was still alive. The executioner delivered a second jolt, another surge of electricity burning through her body, stopping her heart, destroying her brain, ending the life that had ended so many others. This time, when the doctor checked, there was nothing. No pulse, no respiration, no life. At 7:13 a.m. on March 30th, 1998, Judy Benoano was pronounced dead. The Black Widow had finally been stopped. Her killing spree ended not by remorse or conscience, but by the state of Florida's determination to see justice served. The witnesses filed out of the chamber in silence. Some were crying tears of relief, tears of grief for victims long dead, tears for the brokenness of a world where such evil exists. John Gentry made a brief statement to reporters outside. "Justice has been served. I can finally move forward." The families of Bobby Joe Morris and Michael Benoano declined to comment, their grief too private for public consumption. Judy's body was removed from the electric chair and taken to the prison morgue. She'd left instructions for her remains to be cremated and scattered at sea. One final attempt to erase herself, to disappear without trace or memorial. She would get no headstone, no marker, no place where people could come and remember. She'd wanted to be forgotten, to vanish as completely as she tried to make her victims vanish. The aftermath of Judy's execution sparked renewed debate about the death penalty, particularly about executing women. Critics argued that the electric chair was barbaric, that the execution had been botched by the need for multiple jolts, that even someone as guilty as Judy deserved a more humane death. Supporters countered that Judy had shown no humanity to her victims, that Michael had died slowly in terror as he drowned, that Bobby Joe had suffered for months as poison destroyed his organs, that she tried to blow John Gentry apart with a car bomb. In the years since her execution, Judy Benoano has become a case study in criminal psychology, a textbook example of a female serial killer who defied traditional patterns. Most female serial killers are motivated by mercy or revenge. Judy was motivated purely by greed. Most show remorse eventually. Judy never did. Most target strangers or patients. Judy targeted the people who trusted her most: her husband, her boyfriend, her own son. True crime enthusiasts still debate whether there were more victims, whether the 3 confirmed murders were just the tip of an iceberg extending back decades. Judy lived in multiple states, had multiple relationships, and investigators only scratched the surface before she was executed. How many other accidental deaths might have been murders? How many other insurance payouts were actually blood money? The full scope of her crimes may never be known. What is known is this: Judy Benoano represents the darkest aspects of human nature, the capacity for betrayal, the ability to weaponize trust, the willingness to sacrifice others for personal gain. She proved that monsters don't always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they sleep beside you, cook your meals, kiss you goodnight, and plot your death with the same casual efficiency other people use to plan vacations. Michael Benoano was 19 when his mother drowned him. He'd trusted her completely, had no reason to suspect her, had called out to her for help as he sank beneath the water. His last moments were terror and confusion, wondering why his mother wasn't saving him, not understanding that she was the reason he was dying. Bobby Joe Morris suffered for months, his body slowly shutting down, poisoned by the woman who claimed to love him. He died thinking his illness was just bad luck, random tragedy, never knowing that every meal Judy prepared was laced with his death. James Goodyear served his country, came home to his family, and was murdered by his wife for insurance money. He probably never even knew he was being poisoned, never suspected the woman he'd married was capable of such evil. John Gentry is the lucky one, he survived. But he lives with the knowledge that the woman he loved, the woman he planned to marry, tried to blow him apart with a car bomb. He carries the scars, both physical and psychological, of Judy's attempt on his life. He's the one who got away, but he'll never be free of the trauma she inflicted. These are Judy's victims, the confirmed ones. Anyway, these are the lives she destroyed, the families she shattered, the futures she stole. And for what? For money. For comfort. For the ability to maintain a lifestyle she felt entitled to regardless of the cost in human suffering. The story of Judy Benoano is a reminder that evil exists, that it often wears a familiar face, that the people who hurt us most deeply are frequently the ones we trust most completely. It's a cautionary tale about the danger of ignoring warning signs, about the importance of questioning deaths that seem too convenient, about the necessity of holding people accountable regardless of their gender or their performance of grief. When the electric chair ended Judy Benoano's life on that humid Florida morning, it closed a chapter of terror that had lasted over 2 decades. But the lessons of her crimes remain relevant. Trust must be earned, not assumed. Love is not a shield against evil, and sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one sharing your bed, raising your children, and planning your funeral while you're still alive. Judy Benoano is dead, but her victims remain dead too. Justice was served, but it came too late for Michael, too late for Bobby Joe, too late for James. All we can do now is remember them, honor their memories by telling their stories, and stay vigilant against the monsters who walk among us wearing human faces and speaking words of love while their hearts beat with murderous intent. The Black Widow hunted for profit. In the end, justice hunted her back, and this time the prey didn't escape. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Spider's Web. The David Bullock Case. Some men don't just cross lines, they erase them entirely, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. What happens when the person sworn to protect becomes the architect of unspeakable horror? We're diving into the mind of a predator who wore respectability like a mask, a man who turned trust into a weapon and innocence into prey. David Bullock didn't lurk in shadows. He built his hunting ground in plain sight, behind locked doors where screams went unheard and suffering became routine. This isn't just a story about evil. This is about the calculated destruction of lives, one deliberate act at a time. David Bullock understood something most people never grasp. Monsters don't announce themselves. They blend in. They smile at neighbors, hold steady jobs, and cultivate an image so ordinary that suspicion never takes root. For years, Bullock perfected this performance, constructing a life that appeared unremarkable on the surface while concealing appetites that defied human decency. He wasn't born with horns or carrying a warning label. Nothing about his external presentation suggested the capacity for the atrocities he would commit. That's what made him so dangerous, the absolute disconnect between who he pretended to be and what he truly was. Understanding this duality is essential to grasping how he operated for so long without detection, how he exploited the fundamental human tendency to trust what appears familiar. Bullock's world revolved around control, not the obvious, violent kind that leaves immediate evidence, but the insidious type that slowly tightens like a noose. He selected his environment carefully, ensuring he had domain over enclosed spaces where his authority went unquestioned. This wasn't accidental. Every choice he made served a purpose, creating conditions where he could exercise power without interference. The people around him saw what he wanted them to see. A man going through life's motions, perhaps unremarkable but certainly not threatening. This carefully maintained facade allowed him to move freely, to interact with potential victims without raising alarms. He weaponized normalcy itself, understanding that the best camouflage is hiding in plain sight. But beneath this manufactured surface, something festered. Bullock's internal landscape bore no resemblance to his external presentation. His thoughts circled obsessively around dominance, around reducing others to objects for his gratification. This wasn't impulsive behavior or momentary loss of control. This was methodical, deliberate, sustained over time with full awareness of the harm being inflicted. He studied vulnerability the way predators study prey patterns. He recognized who could be isolated, who lacked protective networks, who might not be believed if they spoke out. This targeting wasn't random. It demonstrated a chilling level of calculation. Bullock identified the cracks in social structures, the people who fell through gaps in community awareness, and he exploited those weaknesses without hesitation. The psychological mechanisms he employed went beyond simple deception. Bullock understood how to manipulate perception, how to create doubt, how to make victims question their own reality. He used his position and the trust it commanded as both shield and weapon. When you hold certain roles in society, people grant you credibility by default. He knew this and leveraged it mercilessly. His methods relied heavily on isolation. By separating victims from support systems, he eliminated their avenues for help. In those isolated moments, he became their entire world, a world where his rules were absolute and escape seemed impossible. This manufactured helplessness was intentional, a core component of his approach. He wanted his victims to feel completely trapped, utterly powerless. The duration of his offenses speaks to both his cunning and the failures of systems meant to protect people. Bullock didn't operate for weeks or months. This went on for years. Each incident added to an accumulating mountain of trauma. Each victim another soul bearing scars that would never fully heal. The sheer span of time reveals how effectively he concealed his true nature. During this period, he maintained his public persona without apparent strain. There were no dramatic shifts in behavior that might have triggered scrutiny, no obvious red flags that would have prompted investigation. He compartmentalized with disturbing efficiency, keeping his predatory activities sealed off from his daily interactions. This ability to function normally while committing horrific acts demonstrates a particularly chilling form of psychological functioning. What drove him remains a question that haunts those who study such cases. Was it purely about power, sexual gratification, some twisted need to dominate and destroy? Likely all of these elements intertwined, creating a motivational cocktail that pushed him toward increasingly egregious behavior. But understanding his psychology doesn't excuse it, nothing could. The environment he created was deliberately designed to prevent exposure. He controlled the narrative, the physical space, the timing of interactions. Every variable that might lead to discovery was carefully managed. This level of orchestration requires sustained effort, constant vigilance, and an absolute disregard for the humanity of others. His victims existed in a nightmare that defied outside comprehension. They endured violations that stripped away dignity, safety, and trust in the most fundamental aspects of human interaction. The psychological damage extended far beyond the physical acts themselves, warping their ability to feel secure, to believe in justice, to trust that the world contained more good than evil. Bullock's success in avoiding detection for so long also indicts the systems meant to safeguard vulnerable populations. Where were the oversight mechanisms? Why didn't anyone notice the patterns? How did someone operating within institutional structures evade accountability year after year? These questions demand answers, not to excuse his actions, but to understand how prevention failed so catastrophically. He moved through his double life with apparent ease, presenting one face to the world while pursuing depravity in private. This bifurcation of identity is common among predators who maintain conventional lives while committing terrible acts. They become skilled performers, always aware of their audience and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The banality of his external existence made the contrast with his crimes even more disturbing. There was no obvious pathology visible to casual observers, no clear markers that would have prompted concern. He appeared utterly ordinary, and that ordinariness was his greatest asset. People trust the familiar. They assume that evil announces itself loudly. Bullock proved how fatally wrong that assumption can be. As time passed and his offenses continued, one wonders whether he felt invincible. Did he believe he would never face consequences? Perhaps his success bred arrogance, a sense that he had mastered the art of deception so completely that exposure was impossible. If so, that arrogance would eventually contribute to his downfall. But before that reckoning came, years of suffering accumulated. Victims carried their trauma in silence, either too afraid to speak or convinced they wouldn't be believed. Bullock had created an environment where even acknowledging what happened felt impossible, where the weight of shame and fear kept mouths shut and pain internalized. The architecture of his crimes, the planning, the execution, the concealment, reveals someone who had thought deeply about how to get away with the unthinkable. This wasn't passion or impulse. This was cold, calculated predation conducted with the efficiency of someone who had refined his approach through repetition. Every day that passed with his secret intact was another day of freedom he didn't deserve. Another day his victims lived with unresolved trauma. Another day the community remained unaware of the monster in their midst. The clock was ticking toward inevitable exposure, but for those suffering under his actions, that future justice offered no relief in their present agony. Every predator makes mistakes eventually. The question is never if they'll be exposed, but when and how much damage they'll inflict before that moment arrives. For David Bullock, the unraveling began not with a dramatic revelation, but with small cracks in his carefully constructed facade, hairline fractures that would eventually shatter his entire world. The first whispers came quietly. A victim found courage in unexpected places, perhaps emboldened by something they read, someone they met, or simply reaching a breaking point where silence became more unbearable than speaking. That initial disclosure set off ripples that would become waves, then eventually a tsunami of truth that Bullock couldn't control or contain. When victims of sustained abuse finally speak, they often do so with trembling voices and uncertain words. The trauma they've endured makes trust feel impossible, makes believing in justice seem naive. They've been conditioned to expect disbelief, blame, or dismissal. So that first conversation with someone who actually listens, who believes, who validates their experience, that moment changes everything. For Bullock, this was the beginning of the end. He had relied on silence, on shame, on the assumption that his victims would remain isolated in their suffering. But trauma survivors possess a resilience that predators consistently underestimate. When one person speaks, they create space for others to do the same. Courage becomes contagious. As more voices emerged, patterns became undeniable. These weren't isolated incidents or misunderstandings. These were sustained, deliberate acts committed by someone who had systematically abused his position and the trust placed in him. The accounts shared commonalities that pointed unmistakably toward calculated predation rather than any form of ambiguous interaction. Law enforcement became involved, and suddenly Bullock faced scrutiny. He couldn't deflect with charm or manufactured respectability. Investigators don't simply accept surface presentations. They dig deeper, question inconsistencies, and follow evidence wherever it leads. The mask that had served him so well in civilian life offered no protection against determined professional investigation. The details that emerged painted a portrait of depravity that shocked even experienced investigators. The frequency of the offenses, the vulnerability of the victims, the brazen exploitation of trust, each revelation added another layer to an already horrifying picture. This wasn't someone who had made a terrible mistake. This was someone who had made terrible choices repeatedly, knowingly, without remorse. Bullock's response to the investigation revealed much about his character. Rather than accepting responsibility, he employed the predictable tactics of exposed predators. Denial, minimization, victim blaming, and attempts to manipulate the narrative. He tried to characterize his actions as misunderstood, to cast doubt on his accuser's credibility, to preserve some fragment of his false identity even as it crumbled around him. But the evidence was overwhelming. Physical evidence, testimony, digital records, all of it converged to create an inescapable picture of guilt. Bullock had been meticulous in some ways but careless in others, perhaps believing his position and reputation would shield him from suspicion. That arrogance left trails that investigators followed directly to his door. The community's reaction mixed shock, anger, and a disturbing element of disbelief. How could someone they thought they knew commit such acts? This cognitive dissonance is common when predators are exposed. People struggle to reconcile the public persona with the private reality. Some immediately believed the victims. Others engaged in painful mental gymnastics trying to preserve their previous perception of Bullock. This division in community response adds another layer of trauma for survivors. Having to defend their truth against skeptics, facing whispered accusations of lying or seeking attention, these experiences compound the original harm. It's why many victims never come forward at all, knowing they'll face interrogation and doubt rather than automatic support. As the investigation progressed, the legal system ground into motion. Charges were filed, each one representing not just a violation of law but a human being whose life had been altered forever. The formal language of indictments, sterile, procedural, clinical, couldn't convey the actual human cost of Bullock's actions, but it represented an essential step toward accountability. Bullock retained legal representation, as is every defendant's right. His attorneys would mount whatever defense they could construct, looking for procedural errors or evidentiary weaknesses. This is how the system works, and while it can feel agonizing for victims to watch their abuser receive vigorous legal defense, these protections exist for important reasons even when applied to clearly guilty individuals. The pretrial period stretched on with excruciating slowness for those awaiting justice. For Bullock, this liminal space between accusation and judgment offered false hope that he might somehow escape full accountability. For his victims, every delay meant prolonged uncertainty, another day of waiting to see whether the system would vindicate their courage in coming forward. Media coverage intensified as details became public. The case contained elements that inevitably draw attention. A respected community member revealed as a serial predator, vulnerable victims, institutional failures that allowed abuse to continue. Journalists pressed for information while victims' advocates urged respect for survivors' privacy. This tension between public interest and personal protection is never fully resolved in high-profile cases. Bullock's previous life disintegrated completely. Professional relationships severed. Social connections evaporated. The reputation he had cultivated so carefully became worthless overnight, replaced by infamy. Whatever future he had imagined for himself was gone, replaced by the prospect of imprisonment and permanent designation as a registered sex offender. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he maintained varying degrees of denial. This psychological self-protection is common among exposed predators. Accepting the full reality of their actions would require confronting the magnitude of harm they've caused and the depths of their own moral failure. For many, that reckoning proves impossible. The victims, meanwhile, navigated their own complex emotional terrain. Vindication at finally being believed mixed with anguish at reliving their trauma through legal proceedings. Relief that Bullock would face consequences coexisted with rage that justice had taken so long to arrive. Healing is never linear, and for survivors of sustained abuse, the path forward remains complicated even after exposure and prosecution. Support systems rallied around the survivors with varying degrees of effectiveness. Some victims had families, friends, and advocates who provided unconditional support. Others faced skepticism or blame from people who should have protected them. These differential experiences of social support significantly impact long-term recovery, adding another dimension of injustice to an already unjust situation. Throughout this period of unraveling, certain questions haunted everyone involved. How had this continued for so long? Why hadn't anyone intervened sooner? What systemic failures allowed a predator to operate with such impunity? These questions matter not just for understanding this specific case, but for preventing future atrocities. The investigation uncovered not just Bullock's crimes, but also the environments that enabled them. Gaps in oversight, inadequate reporting mechanisms, cultural dynamics that privileged reputation over protection. All of these factors contributed to his ability to offend repeatedly without detection. Understanding these enabling conditions is essential for meaningful reform. As the legal process advanced toward resolution, the weight of evidence made certain outcomes increasingly inevitable. Bullock would face trial. He would be held accountable. The only remaining questions concerned the specific charges, the potential sentences, and whether he would finally accept responsibility or maintain his denials to the bitter end. For those who had suffered under his predation, this approaching reckoning carried profound significance. It wouldn't undo the harm or erase the trauma, but it would affirm that their experiences mattered, that the justice system recognized the wrongs committed against them, that their voices had power after years of enforced silence. The unraveling of David Bullock's false life was complete. What remained was the formal pronouncement of judgment and the beginning of a very different existence, one defined not by the respectable mask he had worn, but by the inexcusable reality of his actions. Courtrooms possess a particular gravity. The wood paneling, the elevated judge's bench, the formal protocols, all of it designed to convey the weight of justice being administered. When David Bullock entered that space to face judgment, he walked into an environment where his usual tactics of manipulation and deception held no power. Here, facts mattered, evidence mattered, truth mattered. The trial, if it proceeded to that point, or the sentencing hearing, would force an accounting of every deliberate choice he had made to harm others. No more hiding behind carefully constructed lies. No more exploiting trust and position to avoid consequences. The mechanisms of justice, imperfect as they are, were finally focused completely on his actions. Prosecutors presented their case with methodical thoroughness. Each charge represented a human being whose life had been violated, whose trust had been weaponized against them. The clinical language of legal proceedings couldn't capture the emotional devastation, but it established beyond doubt the pattern of predatory behavior that defined Bullock's true character. Victim impact statements brought the human cost into sharp focus. These testimonies, difficult to deliver, painful to hear, gave voice to suffering that Bullock had tried to keep silent. Survivors spoke of shattered trust, of years spent navigating trauma, of the exhausting work of rebuilding a sense of safety and self-worth after experiencing such profound violations. Some victims described hypervigilance that never fully subsides, an inability to relax because their nervous systems learned that danger could come from the most unexpected sources. Others spoke of relationship difficulties, of struggling to form intimate connections when intimacy itself had become associated with harm. The ripple effects of trauma extend far beyond the original offenses. Several described the particular agony of not being believed initially, of carrying their truth in isolation while watching Bullock continue his normal life. That secondary victimization, the denial and dismissal they faced when trying to disclose abuse, compounded the original trauma. It taught them that speaking up meant risking further harm, a lesson that kept many silent for years. One common thread ran through nearly every statement: the profound betrayal of trust. Bullock had occupied a position that carried implicit promises of safety and protection. Instead, he had inverted those expectations, transforming what should have been secure environments into hunting grounds. This violation of foundational trust does damage that extends across victims' entire worldview. The defense, obligated to represent their client, made whatever arguments they could construct. Perhaps they challenged procedural aspects, questioned evidentiary standards, or attempted to introduce mitigating factors. But when faced with overwhelming evidence and multiple consistent accounts, legal maneuvering offers limited protection. The facts remained stubbornly, undeniably damning. Bullock himself faced a choice: accept responsibility or maintain denial to the end. Many predators, even when caught and convicted, cannot bring themselves to fully acknowledge their actions. Accepting the truth would require confronting the enormity of harm they've caused, recognizing themselves as the monsters they actually are. That psychological reckoning proves impossible for some. If he chose to speak, his words were scrutinized for genuine remorse versus performative contrition. Victims and observers who had witnessed his manipulations throughout his life could distinguish between authentic accountability and another layer of deception. True remorse involves accepting full responsibility without excuses, something rare among serial predators. The judge, having reviewed all evidence and heard all testimony, delivered a sentence that reflected the severity and scope of Bullock's crimes. Multiple offenses over extended time periods, vulnerable victims, abuse of position. All of these factors influenced the determination of appropriate punishment. Whatever specific sentence was imposed, it carried the weight of society's condemnation. For victims, the sentencing represented a form of validation. The system had recognized the wrongs committed against them as real, serious, and deserving of significant consequences. This doesn't erase trauma or restore what was taken, but it affirms that their experiences matter, that justice, however imperfect, attempted to address their suffering. Bullock's departure from the courtroom as a convicted offender marked the end of his freedom. He would be transported to prison, where he would begin serving whatever sentence was imposed. The man who had exercised such control over others would now experience a complete loss of autonomy, living according to institutional rules and schedules not of his choosing. Prison represents a particular hell for sex offenders. Even within a population of convicted criminals, those who have committed sexual offenses occupy the lowest position in the hierarchy. They face isolation, hostility, and violence from other inmates. While this reality raises complex questions about prison culture and safety, it's a consequence Bullock would now navigate firsthand. His name would be entered into sex offender registries, a permanent public record of his crimes. This designation carries lifelong consequences, affecting where he can live, what jobs he can hold, and how he must interact with law enforcement. It ensures that communities will always know about his past, that he'll never again enjoy the anonymity that allowed his predation. The media coverage of the verdict and sentencing brought additional public scrutiny. His name became synonymous with abuse and betrayal. Whatever legacy he might have hoped to leave was replaced by infamy. This public marking serves both specific and general deterrence, punishment for him and warning to others who might consider similar acts. For the survivors, life continued beyond the courtroom. Justice delivered offers a form of closure, but it doesn't automatically heal trauma. They still faced the ongoing work of recovery, of rebuilding lives that had been profoundly disrupted by Bullock's actions. Therapy, support groups, time, and tremendous personal strength would be required. Some victims found that the trial and sentencing allowed them to finally move forward. Having their experiences validated by the justice system and seeing their abuser held accountable created a sense that this chapter could close. Others discovered that legal resolution didn't bring the peace they'd hoped for, that trauma has its own timeline independent of judicial proceedings. The community, too, had to reckon with what had happened in their midst. How had Bullock operated for so long without detection? What warning signs were missed? What changes needed to be implemented to prevent future predators from exploiting similar vulnerabilities? These questions demanded honest examination and meaningful reform. Institutions where Bullock had operated faced scrutiny and potential liability. If systemic failures had enabled his offenses, those organizations bore responsibility for implementing protective measures. Oversight mechanisms, reporting protocols, background checks, training programs, all of these elements required evaluation and strengthening. Some community members struggled with their own feelings of guilt. Thoughts of, "I should have noticed something," or "I should have done more" plagued people who had interacted with Bullock without recognizing his true nature. This secondary trauma affects entire communities when predators are exposed, creating waves of self-recrimination and loss of trust. Mental health professionals emphasize that predators are skilled deceivers. Ordinary people shouldn't blame themselves for not detecting someone who invested significant effort into appearing normal. The responsibility lies entirely with the offender, not with those he fooled. Yet this intellectual understanding doesn't always alleviate emotional responses. Support organizations provided resources for survivors and community members struggling to process the revelations. Crisis counseling, educational programs about recognizing abuse, victim advocacy services, all of these resources became suddenly urgently necessary. The exposure of one predator revealed the need for much broader community investment in prevention and support. For David Bullock, prison would be his reality for the foreseeable future. The control he once wielded was gone, replaced by the grinding routine of incarceration. Every day would be a reminder of the freedom he'd forfeited through his choices. Whether he would use that time for genuine reflection or continue in denial remained to be seen. Some offenders eventually reach authentic remorse after years of incarceration, when they can no longer hide from themselves. Others maintain elaborate psychological defenses to the end, never fully accepting the reality of their actions. Bullock's internal journey, whatever form it took, would unfold far from public view. The legal reckoning was complete. Justice, in its formal sense, had been administered, but the true measure of reckoning extended far beyond the courtroom. To the ongoing healing journeys of survivors, to the community's efforts to prevent future abuse, to the systemic reforms needed to protect vulnerable people. That work would continue long after Bullock's cell door closed. Justice delivered doesn't mean healing completed. For the survivors of David Bullock's predation, the verdict and sentencing marked not an ending but a transition. From the acute crisis of exposure and legal proceedings to the long, difficult work of rebuilding lives fractured by trauma. Trauma rewires the brain in profound ways. The nervous system learns to stay in a heightened state of alert, constantly scanning for danger. Sleep becomes difficult because the body won't fully relax. Relationships suffer because trust feels impossible when someone who should have been trustworthy proved to be a predator. These aren't choices survivors make. They're physiological and psychological responses to overwhelming harm. Each survivor's path forward took a unique shape based on individual circumstances, support systems, and internal resources. Some engaged intensively with therapy, working through trauma with professional guidance. Evidence-based approaches like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or EMDR help some process their experiences and develop healthier coping mechanisms. Others found healing through peer support, connecting with fellow survivors who understood their experiences without explanation. These connections combat the isolation that predators deliberately cultivate. Knowing others have walked similar paths and found ways forward offers hope when healing feels impossible. Support groups created spaces where survivors could speak truth without fear of judgment. The criminal justice process itself had been re-traumatizing for many. Being cross-examined, having their credibility questioned, reliving their worst experiences in public settings, these necessary elements of prosecution came at psychological cost. Some victims questioned whether pursuing justice had been worth the additional trauma, while others felt validated by the process despite its difficulty. Family members of survivors carried their own burdens. Parents struggled with guilt over not protecting their children. Partners worked to support loved ones through flashbacks and nightmares. Siblings wrestled with rage toward the perpetrator and helplessness about the suffering they couldn't prevent. Trauma ripples outward, affecting entire networks of relationships. Certain dates, anniversaries of abuse, court proceedings, or Bullock's birthday triggered heightened distress for some survivors. These temporal markers became landmines in the calendar, requiring careful navigation and often additional support. Over time, some found these triggers diminished in intensity, while others continued to struggle with predictable cyclical difficulties. Professional functioning represented another challenge. Some survivors found that work provided helpful structure and distraction, while others struggled with concentration and motivation. Careers were sometimes derailed by trauma symptoms, creating financial stress that compounded emotional difficulties. The economic impact of abuse rarely receives adequate attention but significantly affects recovery. Physical health consequences emerged for many. Trauma manifests somatically: chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues, cardiovascular problems, and immune dysfunction all correlate with histories of abuse. The mind-body connection means that psychological wounds create physical symptoms, requiring holistic treatment approaches that address both dimensions. Some survivors channeled their experiences into advocacy work. They became voices for prevention, education, and systemic reform. This meaning-making can be therapeutically powerful, transforming suffering into purpose, using personal pain to protect others. But advocacy carries risks of vicarious trauma and burnout, requiring careful boundaries and self-care. Others chose privacy, focusing inward on personal healing rather than public engagement. Both approaches are valid. Some survivors need to speak and be heard, while others need protection from further exposure. There's no single right way to move forward after trauma, only the path that feels sustainable for each individual. The community continued wrestling with uncomfortable questions. How had institutional structures failed so completely? Investigations revealed patterns of missed warning signs, inadequate supervision, and cultures that prioritized reputation over protection. These findings demanded systemic overhauls, not just symbolic gestures. Educational institutions implemented enhanced training for staff on recognizing and reporting abuse. Background check procedures were strengthened. Supervision protocols were revised to reduce opportunities for isolated contact between adults and minors. These reforms came too late for Bullock's victims but aimed to protect future generations. Yet reform faces resistance. Changes require resources, disrupt established patterns, and force uncomfortable confrontations with past failures. Some individuals and institutions embraced necessary evolution, while others engaged in defensive minimization, treating reforms as overreactions rather than appropriate responses to demonstrated vulnerabilities. Legal scholars and victim advocates examined the case for broader lessons. What policies might have enabled earlier detection? How can reporting mechanisms be improved to empower potential victims? What role should bystander intervention training play in professional settings? These policy discussions translated one community's tragedy into potential protection for others. The broader cultural conversation about abuse, power, and accountability continued evolving. Movements empowering survivors to speak out created space for more disclosures, which in turn revealed the stunning prevalence of sexual violence. Society grappled with the realization that predators don't just exist in distant horror stories. They're sometimes people we know, trust, and respect. This cultural reckoning challenged comfortable assumptions. It demanded acknowledging that nice-seeming people sometimes commit terrible acts, that conventional markers of respectability don't guarantee good character, that we must believe survivors even when their accounts implicate unexpected perpetrators. These shifts require epistemic humility, accepting that our perceptions can be wrong. For David Bullock, prison life ground forward in its monotonous brutality. Whether he spent his time in genuine reflection or continued psychological evasion remained between him and his conscience. Some offenders complete treatment programs and demonstrate changed thinking. Many don't. Recidivism rates for sex offenders are sobering, though nuanced discussion reveals variation based on offense type and treatment engagement. His eventual release, whenever it came, would be heavily restricted. Parole conditions, registry requirements, residence restrictions, and community notification would constrain his freedom permanently. The justice system's response extends beyond imprisonment to lifetime monitoring, reflecting society's assessment that sexual predators pose ongoing risk. This punitive approach raises complex questions. Does punishment serve rehabilitation or merely vengeance? Can sex offenders genuinely change, or does their psychological makeup make recidivism inevitable? What balance should exist between offender rights and community protection? These debates continue without easy resolution. For survivors, Bullock's potential eventual release represented another challenge to navigate. Some felt triggered by the prospect of his regaining any freedom, while others had progressed to a place where his circumstances no longer dominated their emotional landscape. The varied responses illustrated that healing trajectories differ dramatically across individuals. Years passed. For some survivors, the acute pain gradually subsided, replaced by a more manageable integration of their experiences into their broader life narratives. They developed relationships, pursued careers, found joy and meaning despite their histories. Resilience isn't erasure of trauma, but the capacity to build fulfilling lives alongside it. Others continued struggling more visibly. Mental health challenges persisted. Substance abuse issues sometimes emerged as maladaptive coping mechanisms. A subset faced recurring crises that required intensive intervention. These differential outcomes reflected both individual factors and the adequacy of support systems. Those with strong, sustained support generally fared better. The mental health community continued researching trauma treatment, developing more effective interventions based on growing understanding of trauma's neurobiological impacts. Innovations in therapy offered new hope for survivors who hadn't responded to earlier treatment approaches. Science advanced even as individual suffering continued. Prevention efforts intensified based on lessons learned. Organizations trained staff to recognize grooming behaviors. Parents received education about talking with children about body safety and appropriate touch. Communities developed clearer reporting protocols. Each reform represented an attempt to spare others the suffering Bullock's victims endured. Yet predators continue emerging. The fundamental dynamics that enable abuse, power imbalances, cultures of silence, exploitation of vulnerability, persist across contexts. Prevention requires sustained vigilance, continuous education, and willingness to intervene when warning signs appear. It demands believing potential victims over comfortable assumptions about respected individuals. The long-term impact on Bullock's victims defied simple summary. Some achieved profound healing and spoke of post-traumatic growth, emerging from their experiences with deeper compassion, stronger boundaries, and clearer values. Others remained significantly impaired, their lives permanently diminished by trauma they never deserved. All carried scars, some visible in behavior patterns, relationship difficulties, or ongoing mental health challenges. Others hidden in private struggles known only to the survivors themselves. The full accounting of harm extended beyond what any court could measure or sentence could address. Community remembrance took various forms. Some advocated for memorial recognition of survivors' courage. Others focused on prevention initiatives as living tributes to those harmed. Different approaches reflected diverse philosophies about honoring suffering, public acknowledgement versus private healing, institutional memory versus personal privacy. The case of David Bullock ultimately illustrated enduring truths about human nature and human societies. Evil often wears ordinary faces. Systems designed to protect sometimes fail catastrophically. Survivors possess remarkable resilience but shouldn't have to deploy it. Justice, when achieved, matters profoundly but doesn't erase harm. His story serves as warning and call to action. Warning that predators operate among us, often in positions of trust. Call to action demanding better protective systems, stronger support for survivors, and cultural transformation that prioritizes safety over reputation. The monster was finally caged, but the work of healing, individual and collective, continued long after his cell door closed. That work remains ongoing, a testament to both the enduring impact of trauma and the remarkable strength of those who refuse to be defined solely by the worst things done to them. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Burchard Case. A mother's scream echoed through a quiet neighborhood, but by the time anyone thought to look, the silence had already swallowed her whole. They say evil doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it walks through your front door wearing a familiar face, and you never see it coming. We're diving into the darkest corners of domestic horror tonight, where the person you trust most becomes the architect of your nightmare. Leslie Burchart thought she knew the man she married, thought she understood the boundaries of his anger, the limits of his control. She was catastrophically wrong. This is the story of a woman who fought to escape a monster's grip, only to discover that monsters don't let go easily. They dig their claws in deeper. They make you disappear in ways that leave everyone asking the same chilling question. How did no one see this coming? Leslie Burchart's life didn't collapse overnight. It eroded slowly, like water carving through stone. Each drop seemingly harmless until you realize the foundation has been hollowed out completely. For years, she played the role expected of her. Devoted wife, dedicated mother, the woman who held everything together even as the walls around her grew narrower and more suffocating by the day. The marriage had started like so many others, hopeful, filled with promises whispered in the dark, plans sketched out for a future that gleamed with possibility. But somewhere along the way, the man she married began to change. Or perhaps he'd never changed at all. Perhaps he'd simply grown comfortable enough to reveal what had been lurking beneath the surface all along. A need for control so absolute, so consuming, that it left no room for Leslie to exist as anything more than an extension of his will. Friends noticed the shift first, though they couldn't quite name it. Leslie became quieter at gatherings, her laughter growing strained and mechanical. She developed an unsettling habit of glancing toward her husband before answering even the simplest questions, as if seeking permission to have opinions about the weather or what she'd had for lunch. Her wardrobe changed too. Bright colors gave way to muted grays and browns, clothes that helped her fade into the background, becoming invisible in her own life. The isolation crept in gradually. First, it was subtle suggestions about certain friends being bad influences or drama magnets. Then came complaints about her family interfering too much, asking too many questions, making things difficult. Before she realized what was happening, Leslie found herself cut off from nearly everyone who'd once formed her support network. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations were declined. The walls of her world shrank until they consisted of just 4 people: herself, her husband, and their 2 children. Inside that shrinking world, the tension grew thick enough to choke on. Arguments erupted over nothing. A dish left in the sink, a glance that lasted too long, groceries purchased from the wrong store. But these weren't ordinary disagreements between partners learning to navigate life together. These were exercises in domination, carefully choreographed performances designed to remind Leslie of her place in the hierarchy. Her husband's rage could ignite over anything, transforming him from calm to volcanic in seconds. And just as quickly, he could switch it off again, leaving Leslie to wonder if she'd imagined the venom in his eyes, the threat in his voice. The children watched all of this unfold with the terrible awareness that comes to kids who grow up in war zones. They learned to read their father's moods like meteorologists tracking storms, developed an instinct for when to scatter to their rooms and when it was safe to emerge. They learned that mommy's tears were private things, not to be acknowledged or discussed. They learned that normal families didn't feel like bomb shelters, didn't operate under the constant hum of impending detonation. But they also learned that questioning this reality was dangerous. Leslie tried everything she could think of to keep the peace. She walked on eggshells so carefully, so constantly, that she forgot what it felt like to move through space without calculating every step. She became a master at anticipating her husband's needs before he voiced them, at reading the micro-expressions that signaled an incoming storm. She perfected the art of apologizing for things that weren't her fault, of accepting blame for his unhappiness, his frustrations, his failures. She made herself smaller and smaller, hoping that if she just took up less space, caused less friction, he might finally be satisfied. But here's the thing about people who need to control others: satisfaction isn't the goal. The cruelty is the point. The power itself is what they crave, and no amount of submission will ever be enough because then the game would be over. They need resistance to crush, will to break, spirit to extinguish. And Leslie was running out of all 3. The physical violence, when it started, almost came as a relief in its horrible honesty. At least bruises were real, tangible evidence of something she could point to and say, "This is not normal. This is not okay." The psychological torment had been so insidious, so difficult to explain or prove, that she'd sometimes questioned her own sanity. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was too sensitive. Maybe if she just tried harder, loved better, anticipated more accurately, things would improve. But broken ribs don't lie. Black eyes tell a story that can't be gaslit away. And when her husband's hands closed around her throat that first time, squeezing until dark spots danced in her vision and her lungs screamed for air, Leslie finally understood something crucial. This wasn't going to get better. This was only going to escalate. She was living with someone who might actually kill her one day, and worse, who might believe himself completely justified in doing so. That realization should have been the wake-up call that sent her running. But leaving an abuser isn't like stepping out of a bad relationship. It's like trying to escape from a burning building where all the exits have been sealed and the person who locked them is standing there with the only key, smiling. Leslie had no money of her own. Her husband controlled all their finances, doling out cash for groceries like he was doing her a favor. She had no job. He'd convinced her years ago that working outside the home would make her a bad mother. She had no allies. He'd systematically dismantled every friendship, every family connection she'd once relied on. And she had the children to think about. How could she protect them if she had nowhere to take them? How could she provide for them without resources? What if she left and he came after them? What if the courts didn't believe her? What if she failed and made everything worse? These questions paralyzed her for months. But fear has a way of crystallizing into something harder, something almost like courage when you've been pushed far enough. And Leslie was reaching her breaking point. The final straw came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The kids were doing homework at the kitchen table. Leslie was preparing dinner, moving through the familiar choreography of chopping vegetables and stirring pots while her mind wandered to dangerous places. Places where she imagined different lives, different choices, different outcomes. She didn't hear her husband come up behind her, didn't realize he'd been watching her, reading something in her distracted expression that he didn't like. His hand clamped down on her wrist with crushing force. The knife she'd been using clattered to the floor, and in his eyes, she saw something that terrified her more than all the previous violence combined. A kind of cold calculation, a decision being made in real time about how far he was willing to go. That night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into its usual tense quiet, Leslie made a choice. She would find a way out no matter what it took. She would survive this. She had to, because somewhere deep in her gut, beneath all the fear and exhaustion and despair, she knew with absolute certainty, if she stayed much longer, she wouldn't leave alive. Planning an escape from someone who monitors your every move requires the kind of cunning usually reserved for espionage thrillers. But Leslie wasn't a spy. She was a terrified woman trying to outmaneuver someone who'd spent years learning every detail of her patterns. Her weaknesses, her fears. She had to become someone new, someone capable of deception and strategic thinking, all while maintaining the persona of the broken, compliant wife her husband expected to see. The first challenge was gathering resources without leaving traces. Leslie began skimming small amounts from grocery money, hiding bills in places her husband would never think to look. Taped inside tampon boxes, tucked into the toes of winter boots shoved in the back of the closet, folded between pages of children's books nobody read anymore. $5 here, $10 there. It was agonizingly slow, but she couldn't risk larger amounts going missing and triggering his suspicion. She started documenting everything. Every bruise, every threat, every incident of violence or control got recorded in a secret email account she created using the library's public computers during the narrow windows when her husband thought she was running errands. She took photographs in bathroom stalls, holding up newspapers to prove the dates. She wrote down times, dates, witnesses, building a paper trail that might protect her if this ever went to court. The psychological toll of this double life was crushing. Leslie had to be perfectly submissive at home while simultaneously plotting her rebellion. She had to anticipate his needs and moods with the same accuracy as always, never letting on that her mental energy was being diverted elsewhere. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, one moment of distraction could unravel everything. The stress manifested in physical symptoms. She dropped weight she couldn't afford to lose, developed a tremor in her hands that only appeared when she was alone, woke up from nightmares gasping for air. But she kept going because stopping meant accepting that this was her life forever. And Leslie had finally reached the point where death seemed preferable to that kind of living. She researched domestic violence resources obsessively during those stolen hours at the library, memorizing hotline numbers and shelter locations, learning about restraining orders and legal protections. The information was both empowering and terrifying. Stories of women who'd escaped successfully gave her hope. Stories of women who'd been murdered by their partners during or after leaving reminded her of the stakes. Leslie learned that leaving an abuser is statistically the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship. The moment when a victim asserts independence is often when the abuser's need for control tips into lethal violence. She was walking toward a precipice, and she knew it, but staying meant a slower, more certain destruction of everything she was. She needed allies, but reaching out was dangerous. Her husband monitored her phone, checked the mileage on the car, questioned any deviation from routine. Eventually, she took a calculated risk and confided in an old friend during a chance encounter at the supermarket. A woman she'd been close to before her husband had engineered their estrangement. The conversation was brief, whispered between aisles while Leslie's anxiety spiked with each passing minute. But her friend didn't hesitate. She pressed her phone number into Leslie's palm and said simply, "Call me when you're ready, day or night. I'll come get you." That promise became Leslie's lifeline over the following weeks. Knowing someone was out there, ready to help, made the unbearable slightly more bearable. She wasn't completely alone anymore. The universe wasn't entirely indifferent to her suffering. The children complicated everything. Leslie agonized over how much to tell them, how much they could understand without being burdened with adult terrors. Her older child, perceptive and anxious, had started asking questions she struggled to answer. "Why does Dad get so angry? Why are you always sad? Are we going to be okay?" She wanted to be honest, to validate what they were experiencing, but she also needed to protect them from knowing too much too soon. Especially if her husband ever interrogated them about whether Mom was planning something. She settled on a middle path, preparing them emotionally for change without revealing specifics. She talked about how families sometimes need to live separately for everyone to be safe and happy. She reassured them that whatever happened, she would always protect them. She planted seeds without giving away the full plan, trusting that when the moment came, they would follow her lead. Choosing the right moment for escape was its own nightmare of decision-making. Too soon, and she wouldn't have enough resources. Too late, and something might trigger her husband's suspicion, or worse, provoke another violent incident that left her unable to leave. She needed a window when he would be away long enough for her to pack the essentials and get out, but not so long that he might expect her to accomplish more than errands during his absence. The opportunity came when her husband announced a weekend business trip. 2 days away, leaving Friday morning and returning Sunday evening. It was the longest stretch of unsupervised time Leslie had been granted in years. Her heart hammered when he told her, a mix of terror and electric hope crackling through her nervous system. This was it. This was her chance. She waited until his car disappeared down the street that Friday morning before allowing herself a single moment of shaking, tearful relief. Then she got to work, moving with methodical precision despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. Leslie gathered everything she'd hidden away, the small stash of cash, copies of important documents she'd slowly accumulated, the USB drive containing her evidence file. She packed bags for herself and the children with a ruthless efficiency, taking only what was essential. Clothes, toiletries, a few irreplaceable photographs, the kids' favorite stuffed animals. Everything else could be replaced or abandoned. Nothing material was worth more than their freedom. She called her friend, voice steady despite the fear threatening to choke her. "I'm ready. Can you come now?" 45 minutes later, Leslie Burchard walked out of her house for what she hoped would be the last time. She loaded her children into her friend's car, took one final look at the place where she'd been systematically destroyed for years, and made a choice that would redefine the rest of her life. She chose herself. She chose survival. She chose the possibility of a future where she could breathe without calculating the cost. But what Leslie didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that her husband had his own plans. And when he discovered what she'd done, the monster she'd been living with would show her that she'd only ever seen the surface of his capacity for cruelty. The real nightmare was just beginning. The shelter where Leslie and her children found refuge was a fortress disguised as an ordinary house. Reinforced doors, security cameras, a location kept secret from everyone except those who needed to know. The women inside moved through hallways like ghosts, carrying trauma in their eyes and hope in their clenched fists. Leslie fit right in. Another survivor trying to piece together a shattered life while looking over her shoulder for the danger she knew was still out there. The first few days passed in a blur of legal consultations, therapy sessions, and adjustment to their new reality. The shelter staff helped Leslie file for a restraining order, connected her with attorneys who specialized in domestic violence cases, and provided resources for starting over. Her children struggled with the upheaval. The older one withdrawn and silent, the younger one clingy and prone to nightmares. But they were safe. That was what mattered. Leslie's husband discovered their absence within hours of returning home that Sunday. The frantic phone calls started immediately, dozens of them. Each message a carefully calibrated mix of concern, anger, and manipulation. He alternated between playing the worried spouse. "Baby, where are you? I've been so scared something happened to you," and the righteous victim. "You can't just take my children and disappear. I have rights." When she didn't respond, the messages grew darker, more threatening. The restraining order was served on a Tuesday morning. According to the officer who delivered it, Leslie's husband had taken the news with disturbing calm. No outburst, no protests, just a cold smile and a quiet, "Thank you, officer." That reaction terrified Leslie more than screaming rage would have. She knew that smile. It was the expression he wore when he was already 10 steps ahead, when he'd already formulated a plan and was simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. She wasn't wrong to be scared. The stalking started subtly. Her husband understood that direct contact would violate the restraining order and land him in jail, so he found ways to make his presence known without technically breaking the law. Leslie would spot his car parked across from the courthouse during hearings, just visible enough that she'd recognize it. He'd show up at locations she had to visit, the social services office, the children's school, public places where his presence couldn't be prohibited. He never approached, never spoke, just watched with that same cold smile. The message was clear: "I know where you are. I can reach you whenever I want." The psychological warfare extended to their children. During court-ordered supervised visitations, her husband would grill them about where they were staying, who their mom talked to, what she did during the day. He'd plant seeds of doubt. "Mom's confused right now, but she'll realize she's making a mistake," and make promises designed to undermine Leslie's authority. "When you come home, things will be different, better." The children returned from these visits agitated and confused. Struggling to reconcile the doting father, he performed for the supervisor with the monster they'd witnessed at home. Leslie tried to build a new life despite the constant undercurrent of fear. She found a part-time job at a grocery store. Nothing glamorous, but it was income she controlled, money she earned herself. She enrolled the children in counseling to help them process their trauma. She attended support groups where other survivors shared their stories, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Some days were better than others. Some days she felt strong, capable of imagining a future beyond survival mode. Other days, the weight of everything threatened to crush her. The legal battle dragged on for months. Her husband fought her on every front: custody, division of assets, even the validity of the restraining order itself. He hired an expensive attorney who specialized in making abuse victims look unstable and unreliable in court. They picked apart Leslie's evidence, questioned her motives, suggested she was exaggerating or outright fabricating to gain advantage in the divorce. The process was re-traumatizing, forcing Leslie to relive the worst moments of her marriage in excruciating detail while strangers judged whether her suffering was legitimate enough to warrant protection. But she persisted because giving up meant going back, and going back meant death. Maybe not immediately, maybe not obviously, but Leslie had no illusions about what would happen if her husband regained control. He wouldn't forgive her for leaving. He wouldn't forgive her for exposing him. And he definitely wouldn't forgive her for choosing herself over his dominion. Then came the night that changed everything. Leslie had been staying with her friend, the woman who'd helped her escape, while waiting for permanent housing to open up. The shelter had limited space and couldn't accommodate families indefinitely. Her friend's apartment wasn't ideal, but it was safe enough, or so they thought. It was approaching midnight when Leslie heard the sound that stopped her heart. The click of the front door lock being manipulated. She'd been half asleep on the couch, the children tucked into the bedroom with her friend, when that small, mechanical sound cut through the silence like a knife. She sat up, pulse hammering, praying she'd imagined it. She hadn't. The door swung open slowly, revealing her husband silhouetted in the doorway. In the dim light spilling from the street, Leslie could see his expression. Not rage, not passion, but something far more frightening. Calm purpose. He'd found her, and he'd come prepared to finish what she'd started. "Hello, Leslie," he said, voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "I think it's time we talked about your choices." Leslie's scream ripped through the apartment, a primal sound of pure terror that jolted her friend and children awake. Her husband stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. He'd bypassed a restraining order, broken into a private residence, and cornered his victim with nowhere left to run. This was endgame, and they both knew it. But Leslie wasn't the same broken woman who'd lived in fear for so many years. She'd tasted freedom. She'd remembered what it felt like to make choices without permission, to exist without constantly calculating someone else's mood. She'd found something inside herself that her husband had tried to destroy but had never quite managed to extinguish completely: the will to fight back. As her husband advanced toward her, Leslie made a split-second decision. She could freeze, let fear paralyze her into helplessness, and accept whatever he'd come here to do. Or she could fight like her life depended on it, because it absolutely did. She chose violence. The details of what happened next would later be disputed in court, picked apart by lawyers trying to determine who was victim and who was aggressor in those chaotic minutes. But the undeniable facts were these. Leslie's friend called 911. The children's screams could be heard by neighbors 2 floors away, and when police kicked down the door 4 minutes later, for minutes that felt like hours, they found Leslie's husband on the floor, bleeding from a head wound, while Leslie stood over him with a lamp in her shaking hands and terror in her eyes. "He was going to kill me," she whispered as officers separated them, cuffed her husband, checked him for signs of life. "He was going to kill all of us." The officer who interviewed her later, a woman with kind eyes and a weary expression that suggested she'd heard too many versions of this story, squeezed Leslie's hand and said something that would haunt her for years to come. "You're one of the lucky ones. Most women don't survive to tell it." Leslie wasn't sure lucky was the right word for any of this. The months following that terrifying night unfolded like a fever dream. Surreal, disjointed, saturated with dread that wouldn't dissipate no matter how many times Leslie was assured she was safe now. Her husband had survived the head wound, been arrested for violating the restraining order, breaking and entering, and attempted assault. He sat in a jail cell awaiting trial while Leslie tried to convince her nervous system that the danger had passed. But trauma doesn't operate on logic. It lives in the body, rewires the brain, transforms ordinary moments into potential threats. Leslie couldn't walk past a doorway without calculating escape routes, couldn't hear footsteps behind her without flinching, couldn't let her children out of her sight without panic rising in her throat like bile. She'd won the battle that night, had quite literally fought for her survival and emerged alive, but the war raged on inside her skull. The media attention was unexpected and unwelcome. A local news outlet picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about domestic violence and the failures of the legal system to protect victims. Leslie's name was published despite her objections. Her face appeared on evening broadcasts. Strangers with opinions flooded social media, debating whether she'd been justified in defending herself, whether she was truly a victim or had provoked the attack, whether her husband deserved sympathy for his injuries. The court of public opinion rendered verdicts daily, and Leslie discovered that surviving an abuser meant little to people determined to find nuance where none existed. The criminal trial became another form of torture. Leslie sat through weeks of testimony, watching her husband's attorney paint him as the real victim, a man driven to desperate measures by a vengeful ex-wife who'd stolen his children and destroyed his reputation with false accusations. They brought in character witnesses who described him as a pillar of the community, a dedicated professional, a devoted father. They introduced evidence of Leslie's own struggles, her depression, her anxiety, emails she'd written during dark moments that could be twisted to suggest instability. They put her judgment on trial, her memory, her credibility. The prosecution, thankfully, had their own arsenal, the documented history of abuse Leslie had painstakingly compiled. Medical records showing injuries consistent with assault. Testimony from the shelter staff, from Leslie's therapist, from the friend who'd witnessed the final confrontation. Most damning of all, recordings from the 911 call, where Leslie's terror was raw and undeniable, and her husband's rage could be heard in the background, shouting threats that couldn't be explained away as misunderstandings or overreactions. The children didn't testify. The judge spared them that trauma, but their existence haunted the proceedings. 2 young lives forever marked by what they'd witnessed, what they'd endured. During breaks, Leslie would call to check on them, reassure them she'd be home soon, promise that the nightmare was almost over. She tried to believe her own words. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 72 hours during which Leslie existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to eat, unable to sleep, replaying every moment of the trial and wondering if it had been enough. Wondering if justice would actually materialize or if this would be another disappointment in a lifetime of them. When the verdict came back guilty on multiple charges, Leslie didn't feel the rush of relief she'd imagined. Instead, there was just emptiness. A hollow acknowledgement that yes, what had happened to her was real, was criminal, was worthy of consequences. The system had finally believed her, but belief didn't undo the damage. Belief didn't give her back the years she'd lost to fear. Her husband was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Not life, not even close to proportional to the harm he'd inflicted, but substantial enough that Leslie could breathe knowing he'd be contained for a while. 8 years to rebuild, to heal, to teach her children what safety actually felt like. 8 years before she'd have to worry about him being released and potentially starting this cycle all over again. The divorce was finalized shortly after, granting Leslie full custody with her husband's parental rights severely restricted. When he eventually got out, he'd be permitted only supervised visitation, if the children wanted to see him at all by then. Leslie suspected they wouldn't. The older one had already started referring to him in past tense, as if he were a character from a story they'd once read and put away. The younger one had nightmares less frequently now, was starting to laugh again, to play without that watchful wariness that had defined the early years. Recovery wasn't linear. There were good days when Leslie felt strong, capable, even optimistic about the future. And there were days when she couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of everything that had happened pressed down so heavily she could barely breathe. Therapy helped. The support group helped. Distance from the acute danger helped. But healing from sustained trauma takes years, not months, and Leslie was learning to be patient with herself. She got a better job eventually, one with benefits and enough income to rent a modest apartment in a neighborhood with good schools. She decorated it herself, chose colors she liked, hung pictures that made her smile. It was the first space in her adult life that belonged entirely to her, that reflected her tastes instead of someone else's demands. The children thrived there, slowly shedding the hypervigilance that had characterized their behavior in the marriage. They fought like normal siblings, complained about homework, asked for ridiculous things at the grocery store. The mundane conflicts of ordinary family life felt miraculous after years of walking on eggshells. Leslie started dating again, tentatively, terrified that she'd somehow ended up with a broken radar that would lead her straight to another abuser. But the man she eventually led into her life was gentle, patient, willing to move at her pace and respect her boundaries. He didn't mind that she still checked locks obsessively or that sudden loud noises made her flinch. He understood that trust would have to be earned slowly, that her caution wasn't personal but survival instinct honed through terrible experience. She also became an advocate, sharing her story with other survivors, volunteering at the shelter that had saved her life, speaking at events about the realities of domestic violence and the urgent need for better resources and legal protections. Turning her pain into purpose didn't erase what had happened, but it gave the suffering meaning. Every woman she helped escape felt like a small victory against the forces that had nearly destroyed her. Years passed. Her husband remained in prison, occasionally sending letters that Leslie's attorney advised her not to read. The children grew, developed interests and friendships, became people separate from the trauma that had shaped their early years. They still carried scars. The older ones struggled with anxiety, the younger with anger management, but they were healing. Forward progress wasn't always obvious, wasn't always steady, but it was happening. On the anniversary of the night Leslie had fought back, defended herself against the man who'd spent years trying to kill her spirit before finally attempting to kill her body. She did something she'd never managed before. She looked at herself in the mirror and felt something resembling pride. She'd survived. Not just physically, though that was its own miracle, but psychologically, spiritually. She'd refused to let her husband's cruelty define her forever. She'd taken the shattered pieces of her life and assembled them into something new, something that actually resembled living rather than merely existing. The story of Leslie Burchart isn't a neat, satisfying tale with a clear resolution. The damage inflicted doesn't disappear when the perpetrator goes to prison. The fear doesn't evaporate when the legal system finally acknowledges wrongdoing. Recovery is messy, ongoing, complicated. But Leslie made it out, against tremendous odds, with inadequate resources and a system that too often fails victims like her. She clawed her way to freedom and built a life worth living on the other side of hell. And that, in itself, is a kind of justice. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Nathaniel Burkett Case. Some people collect memories. Nathaniel Burkett collected lives. When the police finally broke through that basement door, they found hell had an address. We're diving into the mind of a man who didn't just break the law, he shattered every boundary between human and monster, turning his own home into a graveyard of secrets that would make seasoned detectives vomit at the crime scene. Nathaniel Burkett wasn't hunting for victims. He was curating them, selecting each one with the cold precision of a collector choosing his most prized possessions. What the investigators discovered wasn't just murder. It was something far darker, something that proved evil doesn't always announce itself with screams and violence. Sometimes it whispers, smiles, and invites you inside for coffee before showing you the basement you'll never leave. Nathaniel Burkett looked like every neighbor you've ever waved to while grabbing your morning newspaper. Average height, unremarkable features, the kind of face that dissolves into a crowd without leaving a single impression. He worked a steady job, paid his taxes on time, and maintained his property with the meticulous care of someone who understood that appearances mattered. The lawn stayed trimmed to exactly 2 inches. The shutters received a fresh coat of paint every 3 years. The garbage bins never overflowed, never sat out past collection day, never gave anyone a reason to complain or even notice. But that house on Maple Street held secrets that would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about the quiet man in number 47. Burkett moved to the neighborhood in the late 1990s, arriving with minimal fanfare and even less baggage. He introduced himself to exactly 3 neighbors, enough to seem friendly, not enough to seem desperate for connection. He attended the occasional block party, always bringing store-bought cookies and leaving after precisely 90 minutes. He volunteered once a year at the local food bank, just visible enough to be considered community-minded without drawing real attention. Every action calculated, every word measured, every smile practiced in the mirror until it reached his eyes with convincing warmth. The pattern started slowly, so slowly that nobody connected the dots until it was far too late. Young adults began disappearing from the surrounding counties. Not frequently enough to trigger immediate alarm, but consistently enough that eventually someone would notice the thread connecting them all. They were drifters, mostly, people between lives, between jobs, between identities. The kind of individuals whose absence might go unreported for weeks or months because nobody was watching closely enough to see them vanish. Burkett understood this. He studied human behavior the way scientists study specimens under microscopes, learning which lives society valued and which ones it forgot the moment they slipped through the cracks. He targeted the forgotten ones. His method was disturbingly simple. He offered help. A stranded hitchhiker needed a ride? Burkett pulled over with genuine-looking concern etched across his features. Someone looking for temporary work? He always had a project that needed an extra pair of hands. A young person escaping a bad situation and desperate for kindness? Burkett became their salvation, their guardian angel, their final mistake. The first victim investigators would later identify was Marcus Chen, 23 years old, last seen accepting a ride from a helpful stranger outside a truck stop in 1997. Marcus had been traveling cross-country, working odd jobs and sleeping in his van when he could afford the gas to move between towns. He called his mother every Sunday without fail, until the Sunday he didn't. Then another Sunday passed. Then another. By the time she filed a missing person report, Marcus had already been dead for 6 weeks, his body decomposing in Burkett's soundproofed basement while the killer went to work, came home, microwaved his dinner, and watched evening television like nothing had changed. Because for Burkett, nothing had changed. This was his normal. The second victim, Sarah Jennings, disappeared 3 months later. She was 19, fleeing an abusive relationship, carrying everything she owned in a backpack covered with patches from bands she'd seen in better times. A local shop owner remembered her asking about jobs, mentioned that some nice man had offered her temporary work doing yard maintenance. Sarah's family never saw her again. Her desperate mother plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole within 50 miles. Her face staring out from sun-faded paper for years until rain and wind finally erased her smile completely. Burkett kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings about the disappearances. Police would later find it tucked behind a false panel in his bedroom closet. Each article carefully cut out and preserved in plastic sleeves like a proud parent maintaining their child's achievements. He had annotated some of them with neat handwriting, corrections to incorrect details, personal notes about what the reporters had gotten wrong about his victims' last known movements, even criticism of the investigation's methodology. He treated the documentation of his crimes like a professional reviewing their portfolio, simultaneously proud and critical, always thinking about how to improve his craft. The house itself became his accomplice. Burkett spent years modifying the basement, adding soundproofing that he explained to the hardware store clerk as music studio renovations. He installed reinforced doors with commercial-grade locks, claiming he was creating a secure storage area for valuable equipment. He purchased industrial cleaning supplies in quantities that might have raised suspicions if he hadn't spread his shopping across multiple stores and counties, never buying enough from one location to trigger anyone's memory. His coworkers knew him as reliable and reserved. His supervisor once noted in a performance review that Nathaniel Burkett was consistently punctual and professional, though perhaps lacking in warmth. That absence of warmth wasn't coldness exactly. It was more like talking to an extremely sophisticated computer program that had learned to simulate human interaction without ever fully understanding the emotional content beneath the words. He dated occasionally, maintaining the appearance of normal social development without ever letting anyone get close enough to see the void where genuine human connection should exist. The relationships always ended mutually and amicably after a few months. his partners later describing him as nice but distant, unable to articulate exactly what felt wrong but certain something fundamental was missing. Nobody suspected the friendly neighbor who helped elderly Mrs. Patterson carry her groceries. Nobody questioned the man who always donated to the annual police charity drive. Nobody looked twice at Nathaniel Burkett because he designed himself specifically to be overlooked, crafting an exterior so perfectly mundane that it rendered him functionally invisible. Meanwhile, the body count continued rising in his basement. 4 victims, then 6, then 8. Each one carefully selected, meticulously documented, efficiently disposed of when he finished whatever dark psychological needs their deaths fulfilled. He kept trophies, small personal items that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to him. A bracelet, a wallet photo, a keychain shaped like a cartoon character, objects that represented whole human lives reduced to souvenirs in a shoebox. The investigation that would eventually expose him started not with brilliant detective work, but with a mundane plumbing emergency. A sewer line backup in the neighborhood required excavation, and the city workers discovered something that didn't belong in the pipes. Fabric that testing would later reveal contained human blood. The discovery triggered a systematic inspection of every property on the block, looking for the source of the contamination. When investigators requested access to Burkett's basement for routine inspection, he cooperated with perfect calm, even offering them coffee while they worked. That cooperation was his final performance, his last attempt to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But this time, the mask wasn't enough. One investigator noticed the soundproofing seemed excessive for a basement. Another observed the unusual number of heavy-duty locks. A third detected a smell beneath the bleach and air fresheners, something organic and wrong that experience had taught him to recognize immediately. They obtained a warrant. Nathaniel Burkett was arrested at his workplace the following morning, still maintaining his composure, still performing the role of the innocent man wrongly accused. He went quietly, answering questions with rehearsed patience, never once betraying the monster underneath the mundane exterior. The search of his property would reveal horrors that veteran detectives still refuse to discuss in detail. The basement looked ordinary from the top of the stairs, just another unfinished suburban storage space with concrete floors and exposed wooden beams. But with each descending step, the air changed, temperature dropped, humidity increased. And that smell, the one the lead investigator had noticed immediately, grew stronger with every footfall until it became undeniable, unavoidable, absolutely confirmation of death. Detective Maria Santos had worked homicide for 17 years. She'd walked through drug houses where dealers had executed rivals and left them rotting for weeks. She'd processed domestic violence scenes where rage had transformed homes into abattoirs. She'd investigated serial predators who operated with calculated brutality. But nothing in her career prepared her for what Nathaniel Burkett had created beneath that unremarkable house on Maple Street. The basement measured approximately 800 square feet, divided into distinct zones that revealed the organized mind behind the horror. The first section contained what appeared to be normal storage. Holiday decorations in labeled plastic bins, old furniture covered with sheets, boxes of books and kitchen equipment like any homeowner might accumulate over years. This was the showroom, the sanitized space designed for the rare occasions when someone might request access to retrieve something or conduct an inspection. But behind a cleverly concealed door, designed to look like simple wood paneling, lay Burkett's true workshop. The hidden chamber spanned roughly 300 square feet and represented years of meticulous construction. Every surface had been modified with purpose. The walls featured industrial soundproofing material, the kind used in recording studios and shooting ranges where noise suppression mattered absolutely. The floor had been reinforced with additional concrete and covered with industrial drain systems that could be hosed clean. Bright fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling in surgical rows, creating illumination so harsh and complete that shadows became impossible. Restraint points had been installed at strategic locations, bolted directly into the concrete with the kind of hardware that required specialized tools to remove. Each anchor point showed where patterns, evidence of use, proof that bodies had struggled against them desperately and uselessly. Crime scene technicians would later determine that some restraints had been replaced multiple times over the years, worn through by the frantic movements of victims fighting for lives they would never reclaim. A workbench dominated one wall, its surface meticulously organized with tools arranged by size and function. Saws, knives, hammers, pliers. Each one cleaned to obsessive standards, maintained with the care of someone who took professional pride in their instruments. Burkett had labeled each tool's storage location with a label maker, creating an inventory system that would seem comical in its mundane precision if not for the clear biological material that DNA testing would later recover from microscopic crevices the cleaning hadn't quite reached. The evidence collection team worked in rotating shifts because nobody could stomach extended exposure to that space. They discovered a filing cabinet containing detailed records of each victim, arrival dates, physical characteristics, behavioral observations, cause of death, disposal methods. Burkett had documented his crimes with the thoroughness of a scientist conducting experiments, treating human lives as data points in some grotesque research project that existed solely inside his fractured psychology. Photographs lined one wall like a gallery exhibition, not crime scene photos exactly, but personal documentation of his work. The images captured victims at various stages, their faces revealing the progression from fear to desperation to the hollow-eyed resignation that comes when hope finally dies. Some photographs showed victims attempting to plead, mouths open mid-sentence in frozen arguments for mercy that Burkett had obviously ignored. Others captured moments of defeat, bodies slumped in postures of absolute surrender. The investigators found evidence of at least 11 victims in that basement chamber. 11 lives that entered and never emerged. 11 families who had spent years searching, hoping, praying for answers they'd never wanted to receive in this form. DNA evidence, clothing fragments, personal effects. Each discovery represented another name, another face, another human being who'd made the fatal mistake of accepting help from Nathaniel Burkett. But physical remains told only part of the story. The psychological evidence revealed something potentially more disturbing than even the body count. Burkett had kept journals, hundreds of pages written in neat, controlled handwriting that detailed not just what he'd done but why. He wrote about his victims with clinical detachment, describing their personalities, their reactions, their final moments with the emotional distance of someone discussing laboratory specimens rather than human beings. One entry, dated 3 years before his arrest, described his methodology for subject selection. He rated potential victims on multiple criteria: isolation level, likelihood of being quickly missed, physical characteristics, estimated psychological resilience. He assigned numerical scores, creating a ranking system for human beings as if shopping for the perfect product. The cold rationality of it, the complete absence of emotional recognition that these were living people with families and futures, demonstrated the profound disconnection between Burkett's internal world and human reality. Detective Santos read those journals late into the night, trying to understand the mind that produced them. She'd studied criminal psychology, taken courses on psychopathy and antisocial personality disorders, interviewed dozens of killers over her career. But Burkett represented something she'd never encountered. Not explosive rage, not sexual sadism, not even the grandiose narcissism many serial killers displayed. Instead, she found methodical documentation of a man who seemed to view murder as a hobby, something to pursue with the same casual interest other people brought to woodworking or model train collecting. He wrote about refining his technique over time, discussing improvements to his restraint systems and disposal methods with the tone of someone sharing home improvement tips. He critiqued his own earlier work as inefficient, noting where he'd made mistakes and how subsequent victims received better attention to detail. The complete absence of recognition that he was describing the torture and murder of human beings made the journals somehow more disturbing than if he'd written with obvious pleasure or hatred. The disposal method he'd developed was particularly chilling in its efficiency. Burkett had installed an industrial-grade chemical dissolution system in a separate section of the hidden basement, essentially creating a private crematorium that could reduce organic matter to manageable components. He'd researched the chemistry extensively, experimenting with different solutions until finding the optimal combination of acids and bases that could completely break down human remains in 48 to 72 hours. The exhaust system he'd engineered vented into the main house ventilation, diluting any chemical odors until they became undetectable beneath normal household smells. He'd tested the system extensively before using it on victims, running it with animal carcasses purchased from restaurants and butcher shops to ensure the process worked completely and without trace evidence. What remained after dissolution went into the normal household waste stream in small quantities over extended periods, mixed with regular garbage in amounts too minute to trigger suspicion. He'd scattered some remains in remote locations during camping trips, burying biological material deep enough that animals couldn't disturb it and hikers would never accidentally discover it. Other components went into garden fertilizer, literally becoming part of the property's landscaping. The sheer planning involved, the years of preparation and practice, the systematic approach to every aspect of capture, containment, killing, and disposal. It demonstrated a level of dedication that would be admirable applied to literally any other pursuit. But Burkett had channeled all that intelligence, all that capability for organization and long-term planning, into creating the most efficient killing operation investigators had ever documented in a residential property. Crime scene technicians found shopping receipts going back years, every purchase preserved as if for tax records. They traced his acquisition of materials across dozens of stores and online retailers, watching the pattern of someone who understood that purchasing everything from one location would eventually attract attention. He'd built his murder factory one small purchase at a time, each component innocuous by itself, the overall pattern only visible when assembled into a complete timeline. The evidence team worked for 3 weeks processing that basement, carefully documenting every surface, every tool, every molecule of biological material. They brought in specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, forensic anthropologists from state universities, and expert witnesses who would later testify about the unprecedented level of organization and planning the scene demonstrated. One investigator collapsed during the second week, simply unable to continue working in that space knowing what had happened there. Another requested permanent transfer to a different division after the case closed, unable to reconcile the horror of what they'd witnessed with their ability to function in normal society. Detective Santos herself would later admit in private conversations that the Burkett case changed something fundamental in how she viewed humanity's capacity for evil. Because this wasn't passionate crime. This wasn't rage or mental illness in the traditional sense. This was careful, calculated, systematically executed murder as routine practice, performed by someone who lived an otherwise completely ordinary life. The disconnect between Burkett's daytime existence as a boring, forgettable neighbor and his nighttime activities as a meticulous killer represented something that challenged basic assumptions about how evil presents itself in the world. The basement would eventually be completely demolished as part of the property's eventual sale and redevelopment. But everyone who worked that scene carried it forward in their memories, unable to ever forget what ordinary evil looked like when you finally saw behind the mask. Nathaniel Burkett sat across from forensic psychologist Dr. Rebecca Morrison without visible distress, answering questions with the calm patience of someone discussing weekend plans rather than multiple homicides. His posture remained relaxed, hands folded comfortably on the table, eye contact steady and appropriate. Everything about his presentation suggested a man completely at ease, unburdened by guilt or fear, simply participating in a process he found mildly interesting at best. Dr. Morrison had evaluated over 300 violent offenders during her 20-year career, but something about Burkett unsettled her in ways she struggled to articulate professionally. Most killers revealed themselves through subtle cues, micro-expressions of concealed emotion, physiological responses to provocative questions, defensive body language when confronted with evidence. Burkett displayed none of these typical markers. He simply existed in the space, present but fundamentally disconnected from the gravity of his situation. The interviews took place over 6 weeks, each session recorded and transcribed for eventual use in trial preparation and academic study. Dr. Morrison approached the evaluation from multiple angles, trying to understand not just what Burkett had done, but how someone could do such things while maintaining an exterior of absolute normalcy for decades. His childhood, by his own account, seemed unremarkable to the point of being aggressively ordinary. Middle-class suburban upbringing, two parents who worked regular jobs and attended school functions with appropriate frequency. No history of abuse, no traumatic incidents, no early warning signs that anyone remembered or documented. Teachers described him as quiet but unremarkable, earning adequate grades without distinction or difficulty. He had friends, though none particularly close. He participated in acceptable activities: soccer team, science club, computer lab assistant. I was normal, Burkett explained with a slight smile that never reached his eyes. Everyone always wants there to be some moment, something that explains it. But I was just normal. Dr. Morrison pressed for details about his internal experience growing up, trying to identify when his psychology diverged from typical development. What emerged was a picture of someone who'd learned human interaction as a second language, functionally fluent but never native, always performing rather than genuinely participating in emotional connection. He described watching other children play and recognizing that he was supposed to feel excitement or joy but experiencing only mild curiosity about their behavior. He learned to mimic appropriate responses, studying classmates the way an anthropologist might study a foreign culture, cataloging which expressions matched which social situations and reproducing them with calculated accuracy. I realized pretty young that I was different, he admitted during the fourth session. Not special, just different, like I was watching everyone through glass, understanding intellectually what they felt, but never actually feeling it myself. This disconnection extended to family relationships. He described loving his parents in abstract terms, recognizing they cared for him, appreciating the material support they provided, understanding he was supposed to reciprocate affection. But the actual emotional content never manifested. Their deaths, years before his arrest, had required him to perform grief at the funeral, carefully observing other mourners to ensure his reactions fell within acceptable parameters. Did you feel anything when they died? Dr. Morrison asked directly. Burkett considered the question with apparent sincerity before responding. Relief, mainly. Relief that I'd performed the relationship correctly enough that nobody questioned whether I actually cared. And some practical concern about managing the estate and finalizing their affairs efficiently. The complete absence of emotional connection extended to his victims. Dr. Morrison walked him through each documented murder, watching for any sign of emotional response. Remorse, pride, excitement, anything that might indicate these events held psychological significance beyond practical execution. She found nothing. He discussed the killings the way someone might describe a commute or home repair project, mildly tedious but necessary, requiring attention to detail but not particularly memorable once completed. They weren't real to you, Dr. Morrison observed. The victims. They were real, Burkett corrected mildly. I understood intellectually that they were people with lives and families. I'm not stupid. I just didn't care. Their realness didn't matter to what I needed. What did you need? This question seemed to genuinely perplex him. He sat silent for nearly 3 minutes, apparently struggling to articulate something he'd never examined closely. Finally, he spoke. Control, I suppose. Complete control over something that mattered. Work was meaningless, following instructions, producing results other people valued but I didn't care about. Relationships were performances where I followed scripts. Everything in normal life was just going through motions that everyone else seemed to find meaningful but that felt hollow to me. But in my basement, I controlled everything absolutely. Every outcome was exactly what I chose. That felt real in a way nothing else did. Dr. Morrison's evaluation eventually diagnosed Burkett with severe antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic features, combined with schizoid personality characteristics. The psychological profile revealed someone fundamentally incapable of emotional connection, lacking conscience or empathy, viewing other humans as objects rather than beings with internal lives deserving consideration or care. But the evaluation also revealed something more disturbing: high intelligence, exceptional organizational skills, and remarkable self-control. Burkett wasn't an impulsive predator operating from base urges. He was a calculated one, capable of long-term planning and methodical execution of complex operations requiring sustained effort over years or decades. His journals revealed he'd fantasized about killing since adolescence but had waited nearly 2 decades before acting on those impulses, understanding that preparation and patience increased his chances of operating successfully without detection. He'd studied forensic science and criminal investigation techniques, learning what mistakes typically led to serial killer arrests and systematically designing his methodology to avoid each one. He'd practiced restraint techniques on mannequins. He'd tested his dissolution system on animal remains. He'd refined every aspect of his operation before ever bringing a human victim to his basement. The level of planning demonstrated someone who understood long-term consequences and chose his path anyway, not from compulsion or mental illness that impaired judgment, but from cold calculation that this was what he wanted and he was willing to invest whatever effort necessary to achieve it safely. The prosecution team debated extensively about whether to pursue the death penalty. Some argued that Burkett represented exactly the kind of calculating, remorseless killer that capital punishment was designed to address. Others worried that execution would grant him the martyrdom or notoriety he might secretly desire, and that life imprisonment provided more appropriate punishment for someone who valued control so highly. During one interview, Dr. Morrison asked directly about his feelings regarding potential execution. "Indifferent," Burkett responded without hesitation. "I'm not afraid of death. It's just non-existence, and I've never particularly valued existence for its own sake. I valued what I did with my time, and that's over regardless. Prison or execution, it's all just waiting at this point." The chilling lack of concern, the complete absence of survival instinct or fear, demonstrated just how profoundly disconnected Burkett was from typical human psychology. Most people facing execution experience terror, anger, depression, or determined hope for appeal success. Burkett experienced the judicial process as mildly boring inconvenience, like being stuck in extended traffic or waiting in an unnecessarily long line. His trial became a media spectacle, with courtroom observers packed shoulder to shoulder trying to glimpse the monster who'd operated undetected for years. But what they saw disappointed the spectacle seekers. Just an ordinary-looking middle-aged man sitting calmly through testimony, occasionally taking notes, showing no visible emotion as victim after victim was identified and family members delivered tearful impact statements. One victim's mother collapsed while describing the years of not knowing, the desperate hope gradually calcifying into presumed grief, the final confirmation that her daughter had suffered and died in Burkett's basement. The courtroom erupted in sympathetic sobs. Burkett sat unmoved, apparently more interested in a water stain on the ceiling than the human devastation unfolding before him. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 11 counts of first-degree murder, multiple kidnapping charges, and various evidence tampering counts. Burkett received the verdicts with a slight nod, as if acknowledging expected results rather than life-altering judgment. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge, a normally reserved professional known for emotional control, struggled visibly while delivering the sentence: 11 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, to be served in maximum security isolation due to the calculated nature of the crimes and complete lack of remorse. "Mr. Burkett," the judge said finally, "I've presided over hundreds of criminal cases. I've sentenced violent offenders, sexual predators, and individuals who committed acts of terrible brutality. But I've never encountered anyone quite like you. Not because of what you did, though those acts were monstrous, but because of what you are. Your complete lack of human feeling, your inability to recognize the value of human life, your treatment of other people as objects for your use. You represent something that challenges my faith in human nature itself." Burkett listened politely, like someone receiving feedback on a performance review, and said nothing. The house on Maple Street sat empty for 18 months while legal proceedings determined its fate. Neighbors avoided walking past the property, some crossing the street rather than pass directly in front of the building where such horror had unfolded beneath their oblivious daily routines. Property values declined throughout the neighborhood as the stigma of proximity to Burkett's crimes spread like contamination beyond physical boundaries. Eventually, the property sold at auction for a fraction of its previous market value to an investor who immediately ordered complete demolition. The house came down over a weekend, heavy machinery reducing structure to rubble, while crowds gathered at police barricades to watch the physical erasure of a crime scene that would never fade from memory. Some neighbors attended with champagne, celebrating the removal of a constant reminder of how completely they'd been deceived. But destroying the building couldn't erase what it represented: proof that monsters exist not just in horror films and criminal profiling textbooks, but in ordinary neighborhoods, living ordinary lives, hiding behind extraordinarily convincing masks of normalcy. The victims' families faced the complicated grief of finally having answers, while simultaneously confronting the horrific details of their loved ones' final days. Some attended every court proceeding, staring at Burkett with expressions ranging from hatred to desperate incomprehension, trying to understand how someone could do what he'd done. Others couldn't bear witness, learning about the trial through filtered media coverage that couldn't quite capture the true emptiness in Burkett's eyes as he listened to descriptions of his crimes. Support groups formed for the families, people bound together by shared trauma and the unique circumstances of their losses. They struggled with questions that had no satisfying answers. How could they not have known? Were there signs they missed? Could intervention at some earlier point have prevented years of killing? The rational knowledge that Burkett had specifically designed himself to be undetectable did little to ease the irrational guilt many felt for not somehow sensing the danger and warning their loved ones away. Marcus Chen's mother, who'd spent 7 years searching for her son before learning of his death, spoke publicly about the experience during a victims' rights conference. "People ask me how I'm coping, and I tell them I'm not," she admitted. "I'm functioning. I'm surviving. But coping implies some kind of acceptance or peace, and I don't know if that's possible when you learn your child spent their final moments in a soundproofed basement with someone who saw them as less than human. The knowing is somehow worse than the not knowing, even though I spent years desperate for answers." Detective Santos continued working homicide cases but admitted in later interviews that the Burkett investigation fundamentally changed how she evaluated people. "I used to trust my instincts about individuals," she explained. "I thought I could spot dangerous people, sense predators, identify threats. Burkett destroyed that confidence. He was so convincingly normal that I would have walked past him 1,000 times without a second glance. It taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself, doesn't always look like our expectations suggest it should. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor who helps with groceries." The forensic psychology community studied Burkett extensively, publishing papers analyzing his methodology, psychological profile, and the implications of his extended period of successful operation without detection. Dr. Morrison's evaluation became required reading in criminal psychology courses, used to teach future professionals about the most extreme presentations of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. But academic study couldn't answer the question that haunted everyone connected to the case. How many more people like Burkett existed, operating undetected, hiding behind carefully constructed facades of normalcy while pursuing dark compulsions in secret spaces where nobody thought to look? Burkett himself offered no clarity on this point. Prison psychologists attempting to evaluate his potential for rehabilitation found someone completely uninterested in the concept. He participated in mandatory counseling sessions with the minimal engagement required to avoid disciplinary consequences, but showed no genuine interest in examining his psychology or changing his fundamental nature. "I am what I am," he told one prison psychologist during an evaluation 3 years into his sentence. "Understanding why won't change anything. I did what I wanted until circumstances prevented me from continuing. That's the entirety of the story." His prison routine was reportedly unremarkable. He followed rules precisely, avoided conflicts, spent recreation time reading and watching television with the same mild disinterest he'd shown throughout his trial. Guards described him as the easiest inmate in the facility, never causing problems, never complaining, simply existing in isolation without apparent distress or desire for social connection. The complete absence of suffering seemed to frustrate some people who wanted him to experience punishment beyond mere confinement. They wanted to see him tormented by guilt, destroyed by consequences, reduced to visible misery that might somehow balance the suffering he'd inflicted. Instead, they saw someone apparently as content in prison as he'd been in normal life, his emotional flatness rendering him essentially immune to the psychological toll incarceration typically exacts. In year 5 of his incarceration, a journalist requested an interview, hoping to write a book about the case. Burkett agreed with indifference, participating in recorded conversations that would later be published and widely analyzed. The interviews revealed nothing particularly new, just hours of confirmation that Burkett remained exactly who he'd always been, fundamentally disconnected from human emotional reality, incapable of genuine remorse, mildly curious about others' reactions to his crimes, but personally unmoved by the devastation he'd caused. One exchange from those interviews stood out for its disturbing honesty. "Do you think about the victims?" the journalist asked. "Sometimes," Burkett admitted. "Not as people, really. More as memories of accomplishment. Like someone might remember building a house or completing a difficult project. I remember the successful execution of complex plans. That the plans involved ending human lives is relevant only in that it made the planning more complicated and therefore more satisfying when everything worked correctly. You see no moral dimension to what you did? I understand intellectually that society judges it morally wrong. I understand the laws I broke and the harm I caused to victims' families. But I don't feel the wrongness everyone keeps insisting should be self-evident. It's like you're all speaking a language I learned to mimic but never truly understood. I know what sounds to make in conversation, but the underlying meaning that gives those sounds emotional weight simply doesn't exist for me." The journalist struggled visibly with this admission, later writing that the interview left him feeling contaminated, as if exposure to Burkett's complete moral void had somehow infected him with existential dread about human nature's capacity for incomprehensible evil. Years passed. Burkett continued existing in isolation, showing no evolution, no development, no trajectory toward anything that might be called growth or change. He simply was, day after day, year after year, a living demonstration of what happens when human hardware develops without the software of conscience, empathy, or emotional connection that typically guides moral behavior. The case eventually faded from headlines as newer tragedies captured public attention. But in certain circles, criminal psychology departments, law enforcement training programs, victims' rights organizations, the name Nathaniel Burkett remained shorthand for something deeply disturbing about human nature's possibilities. Because Burkett proved that monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't always announce themselves through obvious warning signs or suspicious behaviors. Sometimes they look exactly like everyone else, functioning successfully in society, maintaining relationships, performing the rituals of normalcy while secretly pursuing incomprehensible evil in spaces nobody thinks to examine. The basement where he killed has been erased, demolished, and hauled away to landfills. But the memory remains, archived in police files and forensic reports and psychological evaluations. The victims' families carry it forward, their lives permanently marked by the intersection with someone who saw their loved ones as objects rather than people. And somewhere in maximum security isolation, Nathaniel Burkett continues existing without apparent distress, his complete lack of conscience rendering him essentially unpunishable by conventional measures. He served life sentences with the same emotional engagement he'd shown throughout his crimes, which is to say, none at all. The case leaves us with uncomfortable questions that have no satisfying answers. How do we protect against threats we can't detect? How do we identify predators who've perfected the art of appearing harmless? How do we reconcile the existence of people fundamentally different from normal human psychology? People who look like us but lack the essential components we assume make someone human. Nathaniel Burkett offered no solutions, no insights, no warning signs that might help prevent the next person like him from operating undetected. He simply existed as proof that the scariest monsters are the ones who never seem monstrous at all, who blend seamlessly into ordinary life while pursuing extraordinary evil in secret spaces. The house is gone. The killer is caged. But the questions remain, and the families still grieve, and somewhere in America, perhaps another basement holds secrets that nobody suspects, maintained by another ordinary-seeming neighbor who waves when you pass and offers to help with your groceries, while calculating in private whether you might fit the profile of a perfect victim. The truly terrifying truth the Burkett case revealed is that we can never be completely certain who might be hiding behind masks of normalcy, waiting patiently for the perfect opportunity to reveal the monster underneath. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.